Good afternoon. Thanks for coming back from the break. We're going to get started with this panel, despite the fact that I know it's much more fun to catch up with folks you haven't seen in a long time, because I feel like that too. So I'm Vicki Arroyo. I'm Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law, where I'm also a professor from practice and an assistant dean for centers and institutes. And I want to start by thanking American University and to their partners who put this impressive program together, especially the EPA alumni, of whom I am one of. And as an alum of two offices at EPA, both the Air and Radiation Office and ORD, it's really a pleasure to see so many friends from over the years here. It's also my pleasure to get to moderate this conversation about regional collaboration around the Chesapeake Bay with some true experts on Chesapeake Bay, which I'm not. I just live here and care about it. Our center was launched 10 years ago, though, to inform the federal dialogue with lessons from the states and to serve as a resource to the states. And we do facilitate regional collaboration around climate and clean energy issues. And our staff work on both mitigating climate change and adaptation to climate change. And in that context, we have certainly facilitated cross-state dialogue, including comments on a number of issues, including informing the design of the Clean Power Plan, and then, of course, like many of you, fighting the rollback of important federal policies relating to climate and clean energy. We've also supported regional collaborations around transportation through the Transportation and Climate Initiative in this region, which goes from the Mid-Atlantic up to New England, and we facilitated that since 2010. And also dialogue around adaptation, where the impacts, of course, don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, and the resources are scarce, and decisions of one jurisdiction could affect what happens somewhere else, like, for example, if you use hard armoring on your coast, and that might affect your neighbors. So it's especially important for folks to work together across those lines. And of course, in the context of Chesapeake Bay, all of us in this region and those beyond in the broader watershed play important roles in protecting this amazing resource. So we're fortunate to be joined by a panel today of experts with a long history of working to protect the Bay. And I'm going to introduce them briefly here before inviting their remarks, I should say, on the history of collaboration and their perspectives on what has worked and where there are challenges to collaboration and what challenges overall remain. Ridge Hall is the vice chair of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. He is also a retired founding partner of the Washington law firm Crowell & Mooring, where he launched the firm's environmental law group and was named one of the top lawyers in the environmental field by the best lawyers in America. Most of his recent work relates to the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed. So welcome, Ridge. Allison Prost is Maryland Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Allison directs policy and manages a diverse team of scientists, land use specialists, lawyers, grassroots coordinators, and volunteers to protect and restore the Chesapeake Bay. So thank you for joining us, Allison. Secretary Brent Grumels, who I don't think needs an introduction to this crowd, but he is currently, of course, Secretary of Environment for Maryland. He chairs the 6-state DC and federal Chesapeake Bay Partnership and the 9-state Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, and is a member of the Ozone Transport Commission. And I should also say a leader within our Transportation and Climate Initiative as well. Previously, as many of you know, Secretary Grumels, of course, served as Assistant Administrator for Water at EPA and in other relevant roles leading state agencies, NGOs that work on these issues and on the Hill. So thank you for making the time. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Ike Irby, who is currently the policy advisor for Senator Kamala Harris. But he wants to make it clear that he's here in his personal capacity. In his day job, however, he leads a broad portfolio including environment, energy, climate, science, natural disasters, infrastructure, transportation, and animal welfare. Ike was previously a congressional science fellow in the senator's office, and he did his PhD research on the efficacy of efforts to protect the Bay. So that's mainly why he's here and speaking on these issues. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Ridge, who's going to provide some background and overview on the history of the Bay and collaboration.
Thank you, Vicki. The Chesapeake Bay is the biggest estuary in North America. It begins up in New York State with the headwaters of the Susquehanna River and flows down through large parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. It occupies 64,000 square miles. It's home to 18 million people and growing. It's also home to more than 3,000 different species of fish, shellfish, plants, birds, and other wildlife. It's famous for its oysters, its blue crabs, its sailboats, its iconic watermen, and also based on commercial and recreational fishing, shipping, tourism, farming, other industries. It's a multi-billion-dollar driver of the mid-Atlantic economy. However, several centuries of industrialization and population growth has resulted in significant pollution of the bay and the entire watershed. The principal culprits have been nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And by 1983, it was clear that large areas, most of the bay, was out of compliance with water quality standards. And so the Bay States and EPA got together and they said, let's see if we can do something to turn this around and clean up this entire watershed. So they formed a Chesapeake Bay Program with EPA agreeing to do the scientific support and monitoring. And so the Bay States each agreed to pass laws and start programs to try to clean up their part of the bay. It failed. And the main reason why it failed, despite 2 decades of effort, was primarily there's no mechanism of interstate enforcement. For example, there's no way Maryland or Virginia can compel farmers in Pennsylvania to prevent contaminated runoff from farms and industrial areas from getting into the Susquehanna River and coming on down into the bay. So finally, they got together, the Bay States and EPA got together in 2007, and the Bay States asked EPA to set a total maximum daily load under its Clean Water Act authority. And as most of you know, a total maximum daily load is the maximum amount of any pollutant that can be discharged to a water body and still meet water quality standards. And so EPA agreed to do that, and the state says, we want you to set that, whack up the allocation of the loadings among the states based on their contributions, give us a timetable to get the job done. In 2009, the program got a shot of adrenaline from President Obama, who issued an executive order declaring the Bay to be a national treasure and directing federal and state agencies to cooperate and work together to restore the quality of the Bay and the habitat and other resources. In 2010, EPA did that. They issued a total maximum daily load for the entire watershed. It's by far the biggest watershed TMDL EPA has ever issued. It had at least 3 unique features to it. The most important, I think, is the watershed implementation plans. Every state is required to have its own watershed implementation plan. This plan sets out the laws, regulations, and other programs and measures that the state is going to take to achieve compliance with water quality standards. And it includes identification of the resources, the funding, technical support, and so forth. It included a timetable, a schedule. This reduction was going to be very substantial. In particular, to meet water quality standards, the watershed needs to reduce its nitrogen discharges by 25%, phosphorus by 24%, and sediment by 20% based on 2009 levels. So the timetable was by 2017, the states were to have 60% of the practices in place to meet their water quality standards, and by 2025, 100% of the practices in place to meet water quality standards. And now the states have the lead in carrying this out. It's kind of analogous to the state implementation plans under the Clean Air Act, for those of you who work under that. The states have the lead, but EPA serves a vital role as the referee, making sure that each state is doing its own fair share. And this is critical to the success of the program. EPA has 2 other very important roles. One is to secure funding under the Clean Water Act and to help get it under the Farm Bill as well. And the other is to continue doing the science. The scientific support for the success of this is crucial. In 2014, the Bay States, the governors of each of the states, the mayor of the District of Columbia, and the EPA administrator signed a very important Bay Agreement. This was actually the 4th in a series of Bay Agreements, but they reaffirmed their determination to comply with and meet the TMDL goals by 2025 and to do some of the other things called for in the executive order, including habitat restoration, public access to the Bay and the watershed, and public school education on environmental issues. The Bay Program is managed, is actually run by the program partners. Each of the states has representatives on this. The Bay Program has an office where the staff is housed in Annapolis, about 20 very hardworking staffers. It's organizationally part of EPA Region 3. Ben Grumbles has been right at the heart of that effort, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the management of that Chesapeake Bay Partnership and give a state perspective as well in just a couple of moments. One of the things I've found most exciting about this TMDL is the degree of private sector activity that it has inspired. You see people out there throughout the watershed engaging in trash pickups, stream bank revegetation, tree planting, all kinds of things that they never did before. It's energized the NGO community. In fact, NGOs have gotten so substantially involved that they set up a Chesapeake Bay Funders Network so that they could target the most cost-effective measures and provide funding for those on a priority basis. The environmental community organized under a group called the Choose Clean Water Coalition, and this is a group of about 230 environmental organizations. You would know many of them. They're national, regional, and local groups, and that enables the environmental community to pick and choose some of the brightest and best to work on particular projects, whether it's lobbying Congress or brainstorming incentives to get farmers to do a better job of keeping manure and waste out of the watershed. There have been some bumps in the road, but I think it's been one of the most successful examples of cooperative federalism. We talked in the last panel in particular about cooperative federalism. This has been an 8-year collaboration between federal agencies led by EPA, the 6 states and DC, and the private sector and county and local governments. Now, it's got challenges, and in the next, between now and 2025, there's some significant challenges that are being faced. I'm just going to touch on these. Allison and Ben can talk about them a little bit more in just a moment, but one of them, of course, is funding. You don't get best management practices installed helping reduce contaminated stormwater and BMPs on farms without funding and technical assistance. Federal and state funding is critical to the success of this. Compliance verification is important. It's critical to be sure that people are doing what they say they're doing and each state is doing what they say it's doing. A third area is, frankly, Pennsylvania is the farthest behind in progress towards the 2025 goals, and the partnership is going to have to figure out ways to deal with that. Finally, there's some uncertainty about EPA's role as the referee. We don't know whether this EPA is going to continue the important role of EPA in the past, but because just 10 days ago, each of the states submitted their, what we call the Phase 3 watershed implementation plans. This is the latest version of these designed to get us from where we are today to 2025. A big test is going to be, will EPA rigorously review these? There's another kind of mechanism in place to ensure reasonable progress between now and 2025, and that is 2-year milestones. The states and EPA agreed that they needed these 2-year milestones to measure progress and, again, provide each other and the agency, EPA, with reasonable progress that each state is doing its own role. Well, one of the real leaders in meeting these challenges that I've just described has been the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And one of the leaders in the Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been my longtime friend and colleague here, Allison Prost. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison to talk with you in a little more detail about some of these issues.
Thanks, Rich. Secretary Grumbles joked that he was happy he was going after me. But don't worry, I'm not going to say too many things that he'll get worried about. There may be a few. As Ridge, just one or two, no. So I want to just highlight a few of the things that Ridge talked about and bring some other examples to bear in terms of the success and the, I guess, concerns that we have going ahead. He mentioned milestones. This is something that was adopted in the TMDL, and then when the 2014 Bay Agreement was signed by all the states, that accountability framework also came into the areas of habitat, some of the critters, the environmental education, this idea of setting a plan, checking in on it every 2 years, and being accountable to your partners in the states about it. Prior to the TMDL having these 2-year milestones, we set lofty goals that were 10 and 15 years in the future. Well, it's like I'm going to run a marathon someday versus I'm going to run a race next year and announcing it publicly and having people asking you how you're doing on that training. There's this accountability framework with setting the 2-year milestones. It lets us check in. The other thing about 2-year milestones, politicians are still in office. It is not something that they can say the last administration didn't get done or it's something for the next person to take on. During a 2-year time period, you have ownership over the success or failure of those milestones. And that is a change that we think has been positive in this framework and one that we think should be approached elsewhere when there's environmental or even other challenges. The short time frame, the public, accountability that comes along with it, and the fact that the elected leaders that are committed to it are still there and still in office to be held accountable for it. And the regional approach makes sense when you think about water quality, when you think about fisheries. The Chesapeake Bay system is not contained in any one state. And so if we don't take a regional approach to it, we have our kind of head in the sand that the pollution that happens in one state stays in one state. As Ridge mentioned, the watershed is 64,000 square miles. The airshed is even larger than that. So it makes sense that we have to come together and figure out how to partner, how to hold one another accountable, share the lessons learned. Why repeat mistakes that were made in one state if we can share that knowledge and prevent someone else going through that? Or when there is a success story, best management practice that worked, a law that was implemented that maybe was risky at the time but has proven effective. The collaboration that the Bay Program setup allows for, I think, has accelerated the progress because we can share those lessons learned and really, you're that many more steps ahead in the process. The other thing I was thinking about this is peer pressure. Whether we like it or not, we're all susceptible to peer pressure. And I think in the case of the Bay cleanup, it has proven to be a positive an issue because nobody wants to be the state that's lagging behind. Nobody wants to be the example farm that isn't in compliance or the example industry that isn't stepping up or even among the NGOs. Who is getting grant funding? Who is trying the new practices? Who is leveraging federal dollars most effectively? There is that, there's a healthy sense of competition that I think, again, has accelerated our progress. This is the one point where I think Secretary Grumbles may make a face. With this most recent Virginia administration, I think we've seen this come to bear. They are taking the Bay cleanup very seriously. It's not to say that Maryland is not, but they are definitely comparing themselves to the state of Maryland, who has been the leader in Bay cleanup. And I think there's going to be a little race as we evaluate the watershed implementation plans on which strategies get us to the cleanup fastest. I'd like to say it should be a tie. In an ideal world, rather than a race to the bottom, we'd have the race to the top. And I think that, and I'm hoping that that's what's going to play out over the coming months as we all read the watershed implementation plans. But we did see with the change in administration in Virginia that they were definitely looking north and wondering how they could catch up with Maryland. And all of us are looking north to Pennsylvania. As Ridge said, Pennsylvania is extremely behind when it comes to nitrogen. I would say that there are opportunities for other states or other sectors to hold some of the sectors in Pennsylvania accountable or the state of Pennsylvania accountable. Under the Bay TMDL model, there's consequences that were spelled out by the Environmental Protection Agency. This EPA reaffirmed those consequences in a letter last June to the state of Pennsylvania, and I think that is something that we'll all be looking at as we review their Phase 3 watershed implementation plan. Did they take those consequences seriously? Have they put measures in place that are going to close the gap? With a degree of confidence that it's going to happen? And if not, is EPA going to take the next steps? Are they going to consider doing permit oversight or take back of permit programs for point sources so that they have to make up the differences when it comes to some of the non-point sources? So that is something I think as an environmental community and potentially in partnership with Maryland, Virginia, and the other states. Again, we want to partner, we want to bolster, but it is not fair if our downstream states have to pick up more of the load because Pennsylvania isn't putting strategies in place that are reasonable and especially is not putting the funding in place to actually actually close those gaps. So as Rich said, the Phase 3 watershed implementation plans were just introduced. We're all reviewing them. We'll look to see, I think comments are due in early June. We'll look to see at the public's reaction, the stakeholder reaction, and EPA's reaction to see what will play out to get us to 2025. The other success, I think, is in the realm of funding. I have been spending a lot of time on Capitol Hill advocating for an increase in the Bay Program funding, because the reality is that investment is leveraged 2 to 1 throughout the watershed by private dollars, state dollars, and so there's just an order of magnitude of impact that we can have with this federal programming. I think the other item that this increase represents is the collaboration, because you have the governors and the watershed states asking for it. You have bipartisan members of Congress signing on to the request to go from 73 to 90. You have chambers of commerce. You have farm bureaus asking for more farm bill funding. It is because we're all at the tables together trying to implement the strategies so that no one person, no one sector bears that burden. So I think the sense of collaboration that has been formed through the Bay cleanup effort is coming through as we advocate for this increase and fight back against the 90% cut in funding that the Trump administration introduced. So I'm hopeful we're going to get northwards of 73 and closer to 90 when it comes to the Bay program, but I can say with confidence it will not stop at the 7.3 million that the Trump administration put in. The last area I want to touch on is climate change, science, and policy. I think this is going to be the biggest challenge that the Bay cleanup is going to face. And I think it also presents an opportunity for the Bay as the largest estuary in North America to be an example, because we are going to have to change our techniques. We're going to have to think what best management practices are going to not only stop pollution, but provide communities with climate resiliency. What funding do we need to put in place to make these lasting impacts? We don't just want to get to 2025. We want them to still remain there. So we have to have climate in the back of our minds. What additional pollution is going to come from increased storms? Good news, there's fresh water, there's flushing. Bad news, there's going to be more sediment runoff. Warmer water holds less oxygen. Oxygen is what is driving the whole TMDL process to begin with, or the lack thereof. So there's going to be all different impacts. And so what does this mean for the Bay TMDL, and what is it going to mean for TMDLs across the country? How do we factor in climate change? And EPA is, traditionally been the glue that holds the Bay Partnership together. I think that's called into question when it comes to climate policy and the regulatory rollbacks. They are just going to make it harder for us to get to 2025 and to stay to 2025. So how do you do that? When one of your major federal partners is saying that they're there for the cooperative federalism, is potentially going to hold Pennsylvania accountable, but is not doing everything they can with the threat that is barreling down on the Bay. So this is something that I don't know how it's going to turn out, but it is something that I think the partnership and all the stakeholders are paying very close attention to. So with that, I will turn it over to Secretary Grumbles, where he's going to tell you all that Maryland is going to be the leader.
No. Okay. I'm not going to give a speech. Sitting down, there was one person I could not see while seated, and that was George Hawkins. And I have learned over the years to keep an eye on George Hawkins. And and also, Allison, I do agree with you that Virginia is making great progress in trying to catch up with Maryland. And we are working together with all the other states to be successful. Couple things. One, the last panel, the discussion about tribal state relationships with EPA, and this is about regional collaborations, in particular Chesapeake Bay, but I see Frank Edward-Gishik, and I think of, as I learned that in addition to pursuing world-class science, which the EPA Program Office for Chesapeake Bay is all about, it's also about traditional ecological knowledge. and having citizens, whether Native Americans or not, engaged, providing their insights, their history of living in the watershed, because they are important too. But the traditional ecological knowledge plus lab-based world-class science is really important. That was an awesome, Rich, that was an awesome summary of the Chesapeake Bay Program and the TMDL. All I want to emphasize, for starters, is for those of you who aren't really focused on the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, my first opportunity to meet with EPA leadership under Gina McCarthy as Governor Hogan's Maryland Environment Secretary was to emphasize to all the others in the room, which was states from Colorado, from everywhere throughout the ECOS world, is that the Chesapeake Bay TMDL is not for everybody. It'll never work in some jurisdictions because what it really requires, in addition to upfront investment and commitment financially and spiritually to the science and the data, what it really requires is bipartisan leadership at the highest level, the governors. And because the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, the thing about it that caused the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau and others to challenge it and try to get it all the way up to the Supreme Court was that it had, for the first time, at such a large scale, states willingly agreeing to have this added interstate umpire role of the EPA to review implementation plans that weren't legally required under the Clean Water Act, but are a very important part of the TMDL process. So that is the key ingredient when you're talking about enforceability and Clean Water Act and TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay, this expansive watershed. It's the fact that the states have agreed to develop these WIPs, watershed implementation plans, to be subjected to public review and scrutiny, grading by EPA and Chesapeake Bay Foundation and others, and really focus in on the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the sediment. And as Sean Garvin would emphasize, and all the other regional administrators since then, Don Welsh and Cos Servideo, it's a focus on accounting for growth, tracking progress in the sectors of wastewater and agriculture and septics and stormwater, and factoring in these two other really big elements. And that's just the last two things I want to emphasize. Those really big elements are climate change and the Conowingo Dam. And the Conowingo Dam is because about half of the freshwater flows to the Chesapeake Bay go through the Susquehanna River, and the Conowingo Dam, several miles south of the Pennsylvania border in Maryland and several miles from the northernmost reaches of the Chesapeake Bay, is a 90-year-old dam where the sediment has trapped wonderfully over the last 90 years. But it's now, because the reservoir is essentially full, the wonderful nature of a great BMP and pollution prevention is no longer performing well. And so the nitrogen and phosphorus with that sediment that will leak more frequently is a real cloud to the future of meeting our Chesapeake Bay TMDL. So on these points, I just want to emphasize that, like the Great Lakes, Dave Ulrich, a real leader in regional collaborations, and like the Puget Sound and the Gulf and other regional collaborations of national significance, the Chesapeake Bay has a governing structure, and a structure of where it's not just the governors, it's their environment secretary, their agriculture secretary, and their natural resources secretary, all agreeing to be part of a board of the principal staff council that meets periodically and makes real decisions, plus the federal government, plus opening it up so that advocates and local governments and concerned citizens can be engaged as we go through the mud wrestling of, how much more emphasis we put into the septics and the wastewater and the stormwater, one of the biggest challenges that we're all facing. No matter how strong our MS4 permitting program is, that's a really big challenge and opportunity. And so we have this governing structure that is really important. In other watersheds, Ike, and jurisdictions that are looking for environmental progress is making sure that we don't have silos, making sure we don't even have cylinders of excellence, making sure that we have ag, natural resources, and environment on behalf of each of the governors in the same room. By the way, we still have silos. We have issues, but that's a really important part of a successful recipe for making a real difference and cleaning up the bay. And in terms of water quality, the bay is cleaner than it's been in decades. And it's something to be proud of and show, hey, it works when you invest millions, billions of dollars and skin in the game and apply science and regulations and innovative strategies to see the submerged aquatic vegetation improving, to see other critical measures of success on the upward trend. That's a really good thing. But besides the governance, the other key part of this is really focusing in on the growing challenges and opportunities. I just want to say the last thing, because I've already touched on Conowingo, which is a really big one, and the governor has made it very clear that this is a priority that we need to work hard on and really push for a holistic solution to that, upstream as well as downstream. But the other big challenge and opportunities with climate change. I am really proud that on a totally bipartisan basis, and with Governor Hogan's strong leadership, Maryland and the other states have all agreed that for the first time, this WIP, this Phase 3 WIP, we're also developing a climate strategy. Three prongs to it. The first one is the narrative strategy to put out the programs, to have the practices, to really show we're focused in on the resiliency and the many different types of impacts that people like Jeff Peterson and Mike Shapiro laid out in the 2008 National Water Program's climate strategy, focusing in on chemistry of the water and the temperature and precipitation changes. How do we adapt to stay on track? But in addition to that, the second prong is continuing to invest in the science of climate change. And the third prong by 2021 is to develop numeric strategies in our WIPs to deal with the increasing runoff and precipitation. So there's a real commitment to integrate climate realities and strategies into the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And the last thing I would say, just to show that we're working with Virginia very closely, because I get to serve as the chair of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, last Friday was a historic moment. In Richmond, Virginia, the Commonwealth approved regulations that regulate for the first time carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants. That is an applause. They have been working with the other RGGI states, just like Catherine McCabe, who heads up New Jersey, and New Jersey's working with the other RGGI states to rejoin this Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And what it means is, while all of us are grimacing over the current politics and the lack of progress on climate change, if you look closely, you will see on a regional basis bipartisan leadership to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also protect our most precious liquid assets. And for us in Maryland, that's the Chesapeake Bay. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. And before we turn it over to Ike, on that note, as a Virginian, I will say that there is a bit of a challenge with the budget because there are some lines in there that would not have Virginia move forward or spend money to actually be part of the RGGI dialogue, which is something that our centers supported Virginia on, or participate as much as we'd like in the Transportation Climate Initiative. So anyway, if you know Governor Northam, you might want to ask him to do the right thing, as he's done before with using his veto power there. So we're going to turn to Ike now, whose PhD research looked at the efficacy of the TMDL, and would love your perspective on that, but also the role and the collaborations of academic institutions as well. We've heard a lot about government cooperating across different levels of government and silos of excellence within a certain level of government, but it would be great to hear about that. Okay, cylinders of excellence.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, most of my co-panelists here have talked about kind of the regional cooperation on the governance level, but I'm going to talk about a little more the regional cooperation on the scientific and technical level. As Vicki mentioned, my PhD focused on utilizing, or how can we utilize a partnership between academia and government to determine how confident we are that the efforts we are putting into cleaning up the bay will actually result in the outcomes that we're investing these billions and billions of dollars in. And so if you look at the TMDL and the scientific basis of the TMDL, it's very confusing, quite opaque for outside observers who aren't computer modelers. You ask the question of why is the TMDL asking a farm in New York to do more on their farm than a farm outside Virginia Beach? Why does the pollution that they're doing up there have a bigger impact than the pollution coming off a farm in Virginia Beach? And the science that we understand and the efforts that we put into the scientific foundation of the TMDL really help kind of provide a backstop to people who want to know the real rationale for why you're asking them to take steps to clean up a bay that's not even in their state. And so in this kind of opaque modeling system from the outside, representation really matters on the scientific side of things. If your state has scientists engaged in the effort, then you are going to have an inherent bias to buy in more than you would if there are no scientific representation from your state. And so there are three major modeling systems that helped inform the Bay TMDL. One is a airshed model, so modeling what's going on as air pollution goes from state to state and then deposits on either the bay or on the forest land. There's the watershed model, so what's actually going on along the watershed, and then there's the bay model, what's going on with the water quality of the actual bay. And across all those different components, you have academic institutions partnering with the EPA, with USGS, with NOAA, with NASA, all coming together to provide kind of a regional scientific evaluation of the science that's coming in to serve as the foundation for the nutrient reduction loads that are being asked of each jurisdiction. And so one of the ways that the Bay Program provided this is through a scientific and technical advisory committee that had members of both academic institutions, state and local government institutions, federal institutions, and non-governmental partnerships to provide kind of a backstop and a transparent evaluation of what is going on in the Bay models. And this is incredibly important to provide a level of credibility and transparency to what seems to be an opaque system, especially as the TMDL has been challenged in the courts on the question of, is the science of the TMDL valid? The courts have granted deference to EPA. And so this outside advisory group of more independent eyes from all different scientific institutions kind of allows an outside look at the inner workings of what the EPA and the Bay Program overall has done to evaluate where the nutrient reductions need to come from and how far those nutrient reductions need to be, or how great those nutrient reductions need to be. And this cooperation has been incredibly valuable and would not have been possible if EPA had not made a point, or the Bay Program as a whole had not made a point to be transparent about their modeling. Transparent about the information that was going into the computer modeling, and transparent about the information that they had received from the models, and the complexities and the problems that they faced as they took steps to improve the model further and further down the road. And so, what my research and my role in this is to understand how we can take this government modeling system and utilize the vast amount of academic institutions across the Chesapeake Bay region to provide even more of a transparent look so that we can have an even greater confidence that the efforts that we are undergoing will actually result in the water quality achievements. And so you have academic institutions from like Penn State to SUNY to UMCS to VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science where I was at, connecting and cooperating with NOAA, EPA, NASA, USGS, Army Corps of Engineers, all their different modeling lab groups, all sharing their information across from each other, all providing their code to each other. A lot of the academic institutions are utilizing open source modeling systems, which provide even a greater amount of transparency. And the Bay program then providing their, not only their code, but the methodology that they utilize so that we can then take our other models that we have demonstrated are similarly skilled as the model that the Bay program has used, and go through the exact same steps that the Bay program went through to get their TMDL answer, and run that same information through our modeling systems and see how similar our answers are. That takes a lot of guts from EPA and the Bay program to allow that kind of transparency to come through, because there's a legitimate question that, perhaps that we do this and we find that there is a major discrepancy between these modeling systems. And it's important if that discrepancy was there for us to understand that, so that as we invest these billions and billions of dollars, we can course correct and make sure that we're actually doing things properly. And fortunately, what we have found is that the vast majority of the comparisons demonstrate that the fundamental science underlying the TMDL is incredibly valid across multiple different assumptions. And so, for instance, one of the ways we have actually found minor deficiencies across not just the Bay model, but all of the modeling systems in the Bay by utilizing the comparison of these models, where you can see where they are similar and where they differ, both in terms of time scale, like do all the models say that we will achieve the nutrient reduction rapidly or slowly or whatever, or is the chop tank gonna be easier? We know things are gonna work well in the chop tank, but not in the Rappahannock. And what might those differences be? So if we are unsure of what the outcome might be in the chop tank, but we know that all the models agree on our efforts in the Rappahannock, then let's focus our investment right now in the Rappahannock, because we know that improvement is going to occur, or we are much more confident, I should say, that improvement is going to occur, and then invest some more research strategies in the chop tank to understand what's actually going on there. The chop tank has a lot more weird bathymetry. It has some weird pools and eddies that kind of trap oxygen in different places, and so let's make sure that the strategies that we apply to the chop tank actually work, and focus the investment right now on these strategies that we know will have immediate improvement in the Rappahannock. And then in terms of climate change, we can utilize these models to try and understand what the overall impacts might be of climate change. And the EPA and the Bay Program's model, it's a little difficult to do that right now because it is very old and it's very cumbersome. It still is top of the line in terms of the science and the quality of information that's in it. But a lot of the academic institutions are utilizing these much more nimble, much more transparent, much cheaper modeling systems that we can ask many more different questions of and get quick output answers that can help inform the kind of questions that we should be asking of these more cumbersome federal models. And so this partnership between academia can help actually do part of the adaptive management challenge that the EPA has in trying to alter their course as they do the midpoint assessment right now in 2017 to see what kind of challenges climate change might be bringing. And on the climate change front and the TMDL specifically right now, what we're seeing is that climate change is definitely going to negatively impact the TMDL. The timing of that is a little less certain, but by the expected impacts by 2050 and even 2030, the impacts of climate change, particularly increased stratification, so increased partitioning of the water where you trap low water, bottom water so that it loses more oxygen, and the increase in overall temperature of the bay, which causes it to hold less oxygen, is going to cause the current TMDL levels to be insufficient. However, that insufficient level is, the impact of climate change is much, much smaller than the overall impact of our nutrient reduction efforts. So it's not that climate change is going to cause all of our efforts right now to be insufficient. What these nimble models are showing us is that we can target our efforts more strategically right now to address the water quality concerns that we are most confident that we can succeed in, and apply research more in these other ones that are going to be much more complex. And then just a quick mention on the funding of these kind of efforts. I think working on the Hill, one of the things that is incredibly important is understanding the value of this kind of regional program to places that are not in the Chesapeake Bay. The Bay TMDL is the largest and most complex TMDL in the United States, and one could argue almost anywhere in the world. And the value that has come from this decades-long cooperation in both the governance and the science is being used as a model for other systems. Yes, this exact formulation of the TMDL will not likely work in other places, but the lessons learned are incredibly helpful to speed the process in places like San Francisco Bay, where the administration has completely zeroed out the San Francisco Bay Program, in Puget Sound, in the Gulf of Mexico. So being able to demonstrate that this funding matters not just for the Bay States is a valuable enterprise, and I encourage all of you to go visit your members in whatever place you love, and tell them that this kind of work is critically important for cleaning up the environment across the United States and not just in the Bay.
Right. So thank you very much for that. And I actually think it's really inspiring to hear about all this hard work, and I know how difficult it is to keep these kind of collaborations together when administrations change. And as Ben said, it's so important for it to be bipartisan, and there's obviously so much to be proud of. I'm curious whether or not any of you, to your point, Ike, about other jurisdictions learning from what's happened in Chesapeake Bay, in retrospect, wish that you had known something that you might do differently if you're in a different jurisdiction, or if we were starting now to do this collaboration. And if you just have any quick insights on what might not have gone well, but you think with some changes could have really helped streamline things. Mm-hmm.
I might offer just a couple of things. I think that among the things that have worked very well, the Watershed Implementation Plan has been very effective. The 2-year milestones have been very important. I think the public transparency has been absolutely critical to get buy-in. And let me just give you a couple of facts to indicate the magnitude of this. The length of the bay from the northern tip where the Susquehanna enters it to the southern end where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean is 200 miles. There are 180,000 miles of tributary rivers and streams in the watershed that feed into that, and they're going to stay about the same regardless of how the WOTUS rule comes out. But there are tens of thousands of discharges to those tributaries. Most of them are non-point source discharges for which there's no permit program. There's a lot of farming and stormwater runoff. And one of the points that Ike mentioned is, how do you tell somebody in New York or Pennsylvania that they need to spend money cleaning up the bay when those states don't even abut the bay? Well, when we go to talk to Pennsylvanians, we talk about the Susquehanna River. We point out this river is the drinking water supply to millions of Pennsylvanians, and the dirtier you let it get, the more costly it is for your municipalities to treat that intake water. We point out that the lower 100 miles of the Susquehanna River used to be a world-class smallmouth bass fishery. It's been decimated by pollution, and that's caused adverse effects, ripple effects. We tell the legislators their kids swim in polluted water. We hope that'll get them to pry loose the resources we need. But those are all big challenges. It's hard to know what we might have done a little bit differently, but I think there's a spirit that we're all in it together. I think one of the big challenges is the political will to go the rest of the distance. And we've had good bipartisan support in most states, and frankly, in the federal government, the legislators in the Congress and the Senate from both parties have largely supported the Bay restoration effort. I think the state legislature in Pennsylvania is the biggest challenge, and I don't know what we could have done differently at the outset to change that.
Anything, Ben?
I can't think of a single thing I would do differently. In my life, as well as with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL.
Lucky, Ben.
Yeah, it's a great day. I would just, Ridge, associate myself with your remarks. I would just say to everybody in the room, we're not kidding ourselves that the Chesapeake Bay TMDL is the magic solution to the upstream, downstream challenge, or the upwind, downwind challenge that we face in multi-jurisdictional regional collaborations. I mean, that's part of the reason why Governor Hogan, his administration is suing EPA over, with support from Chesapeake Bay Foundation and others, over NOx emissions, interstate smog challenges in some upwind states, including Pennsylvania. It's also a reason why we keep pushing for more progress beyond just the TMDL, but under 401 or of the Clean Water Act for water quality certifications. And it's why we're pushing the federal government on WOTUS to not swing so far to the right that the ephemerals and the hydrologically connected groundwaters and the little wetlands that collectively comprise the Chesapeake Bay drainage area no longer have a federal safety net. The good thing about the Chesapeake Bay TMDL and the WIP is that it does force jurisdictions to be at the table together and to be looking at problems and solutions. But the upstream, downstream, and upwind, downwind challenge is one that is always going to be a difficult one, but if we have agreed upon governance mechanism to identify the issues and also have a federal government that is willing to play the interstate umpire role on transport and other types of diffuse and difficult pollution problems that absolutely put the health of the Chesapeake Bay at risk.
So at first I wasn't sure what to say, but then I did think of two things that I would do differently, and one is very specific and the one is more general. Polluted runoff is probably the area that we struggle with most watershed-wide, and this is something that I, at my role at Chesapeake Bay Foundation and with our partners, would have suggested that we try to tackle differently from the very beginning of the TMDL, because I think this is where the focus on local water quality, your neighborhood river and stream, would have been a much more effective starting point than I think couching it as part of the Bay cleanup effort, because that's what it's really about. You know, ultimately the Bay will get cleaner, but first all those neighborhood streams and rivers will get cleaner. And I think as we approached figuring out how to fund this and the stormwater utility fee that has since been publicly known as the rain tax, I think in hindsight I would have had Chesapeake Bay Foundation hire a marketing firm ahead of time. I would have prevented then Governor O'Malley of talking about it during his presidential campaign, because that's really when it all started. And this is about local communities, the health of local communities. It's about kids being able to play safely in their neighborhood streams in the summer, and just that whole approach, because it is a two-pronged problem. We are trying to correct development patterns of the past when we didn't know better, when the idea was to move water as quickly as possible off of a property. And now we know that in the long run isn't the right solution. So you have that. So you're trying to correct that past problem. At the same time, our watershed is growing and people are moving in and the population is changing. And so you have acres that used to be natural filters in farms and farmland going to impervious acres. And that is why the polluted runoff, the urban-suburban sector is going up. It is not because those acres pollute more per acre. It's just that we have more of them. So we didn't know better for decades as we were developing. And then we have more of those acres going into hardened surfaces. So I think the whole approach to that, I think we're trying to play catch up now, but I think some different messaging starting, like I said, at the local level and building up, that's something I would have done differently. The other item that it was somewhat absent when all of us talked is we talked about the administrations of the different states. We talked about the various stakeholders at the table. And while through the Chesapeake Bay Commission, the general assemblies of the various states are at the table, they're not as directly involved. And I think where we've had holdups in all of the states, and this is especially true in Pennsylvania, is where we've had willing administrations, they don't control the purse strings. They cannot get things through the Pennsylvania General Assembly. And so they are really hamstrung in their efforts. And so in hindsight, I'm wondering if there was a greater role or partnership, if they could have been more involved, like some of the other stakeholders in feeling more invested in it. Whether it be, again, talking about the communities that they represent. In Maryland, we've had less of a problem with that, but when it comes to things like the stormwater utility fee, how we tackle growth, how we tackle land use issues, you see that disconnect between some of our Bay cleanup goals and what the General Assemblies have done. So that's something that, again, looking back now, our progress could have been faster, maybe, if they had a more equal seat, because there's regulatory, obviously, authority, and then there's legislative authority, and when those two don't line up, it can be a little bit of fit and start.
Those are really great insights. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to double down on Allison's comment of ensuring that communicators are there from the beginning. We miss a lot of opportunities to act on things we know we need to act on because the messaging was wrong at the beginning. And so putting funding and forethought into how you frame what you are doing and the initiative that you want to support is critical for success.
Go to questions, because there are a lot of folks in the audience who have direct experience with this, and I think Ingrid's going to bring, there's somebody over there with a mic, to George, please. Thank you.
Walk forward so I can see Ben. I love the panel, and of course I love what you do. I want to take issue with one comment, which is I love the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but the idea that Maryland has done the most for the Chesapeake is just wrong. There is no question who has done the most. It's not even close, which is Washington, D.C. But the reason I'm mentioning that is not just because it's an important point. The jurisdiction that has met every single deadline for the Chesapeake Bay and exceeded it has been Washington, D.C. The one that has the stormwater regs, the one that has impervious cover is Washington, D.C. But why, and what does it mean for the future of the program?
They have no farms in Washington, D.C.
We have, yes, that's totally true. And the second is the discharges from a point source. I did a research paper. D.C., you all ratepayers, paid $1 billion to reduce 1 milligram per liter at your plant at Blue Plains. $1 billion. I analyzed all of the non-point source programs in 5 states in the prior 5 years, and they equaled $600 million. So Washington, D.C. spent more than all the rest of the states combined. Why? Because we had a point source. So the question that's always on my mind, as opposed to being negative about it, because I can tell you the story, well, in Pennsylvania, we don't know why we're connected. In rate hearings all the time in this city, I had people come up to me and say, I understand I'm cleaning Chesapeake Bay. I've never been there. I live in Ward 4 or Ward 7. What's the Chesapeake? That argument is the same argument you hear in Washington, D.C., and yet we are imposing those costs on urban ratepayers, many of whom are poor. So I think the question going forward for an EPA of the next 50 years, linked to yesterday with innovations, is what do the new kinds of diagnostic tools allow us to do for all those other sources that we couldn't before, that we could do now, so that the identity, I think your point, Rich, is right. Why do you protect the Susquehanna? Not for the Chesapeake, because it's your stream. And if we have real-time monitoring about how your stream has the consequence, just like you would at a point source, then all of a sudden you're in the same playing field, and perhaps that could change. So I'm curious about your thought about how going forward, it's the issue in the room in every watershed. It's point sources that are doing the lion's share of the load is because that's the regulatory system that works. God bless you. The question is, how do we go forward in the future of EPA to get to the rest? I know that's worthy of a day, but that's my question.
Thank you, George, who used to run DC Water, if you don't know who he is. Rich. Do you want to answer that question? I think there was a question in there, right?
One of the answers to the question, George, is that EPA, with the private sector and with other science-based agencies, needs a full throttle effort to usher in the science of precision conservation and using technologies that really help target, and I don't mean target in an enforcement. Speaking of communication, it's sometimes dangerous to use that word, but really identify those areas and cut off. That's right. Yep. I've been targeted. Where you can get the most bang for the buck. But that's not enough. You've got to have the scientific roadmap to say, hey, there's much cheaper, easier, better ways to reduce the loadings in the watershed because the new data is telling us that. What also has to accompany that, as we all know, is the governance process to bring in those currently unregulated sources and help convince them of the opportunities and the reasons for working together. That's one reason why I, with many others, really look to market-based trading, nutrient trading, use of mitigation banks. It's a way, particularly with the trading, as long as we don't create local hotspots and have mechanisms for ensuring real progress, that is a great way. It can create incentives, and it also is going to help us rise to the occasion and stand on the shoulders of the world-class wastewater treatment plants. Like in Maryland, the 67 facilities with enhanced nutrient removal, and like many of the suburban jurisdictions that send their wonderful effluent to Blue Plains, we praise your good work and that of the Washington, D.C. for environmental leader, particularly at Blue Plains.
So I want to let Rich answer quickly, but I do want to get to other questions too. So if you could answer quickly. And I want to note that Amanda advised that we'll just go into the next session and we have a little bit more time because we got a late start. So anyway, do raise your hands and the people with the mics can please find the folks with questions.
George has done a terrific job leading DC Water to compliance. I mean, few people could have done that, and he did it very, very well. I think the big challenge is, as Ben's pointed out, the non-point source discharges. We don't have a permit system for farmers. There is no law that directly controls them. It's left to the state level, and providing financial incentives is the way many states are trying to go. Ben's point about trading, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia all have nutrient trading programs. They've all encountered problems, frankly. We could talk about that offline, but it does hold out the hope that because the cost per unit of reducing nitrogen and phosphorus per unit is lower by a lot for a farm than it is for a point source discharge, there's potentially tremendous savings out there if we can find a way to make that work.
So who has the mic?
Verification and accountability is key, particularly in the agricultural sector. And then provisions are put into the new Farm Bill, Section 1619, I believe, on privacy, where Department of Agriculture agencies, as I read it, they have to keep private any information about whether or not the BMP is working. And that's really troubling if we're going to move any place in the agricultural sector where the biggest challenges are.
So I actually don't think that was a new provision, but what we have found is that where the states are providing or the federal government are providing cost share dollars, there does have to be additional accountability and some of the confidentiality issues. Actually, since they're taking the public dollars, that there is more reporting and verification. So we are working to make sure that happens. Because that is a concern. You know, there have been some cases where BMPs were supposedly installed, and then when they're field checked, they're not there. So especially where there's cost share dollars, whether state or federal, I think is an area that we all can push for there to be more transparency, because they're public dollars.
Couple of points, one that George made and one that Ridge made. There's no question that TMDL has made enormous progress, but it's also done so at huge cost and run into political barriers. Maryland's current cost to make the 2025 goals, the last number I saw was something like $3 billion. Pennsylvania's is between $11 and $15 billion. Now, why is that? And it's partly because of the way the TMDL was designed for efficient management, because it allocates these reductions across different silos for different sectors. It allocates a certain percentage of reductions to stormwater, a certain percentage to farm runoff, and other percentages otherwhere like to septic tank sectors. And the cost of removing a pound of stormwater right now is about $1,500 in the Chesapeake Bay region per pound. The cost of removing a pound of nitrogen from a farm is about $12 a pound. For those reasons, Pennsylvania has looked at what Maryland has done and what some of the other jurisdictions have done, which is trying to bridge those silos by implementing water quality trading so people who can produce cheaper reductions can generate extra ones and let people whose costs are very high use them for compliance. It has not worked very well historically, and there are reasons for that. But where Pennsylvania is moving now is to transcend water quality trading completely. They are going to authorize state procurement of nutrient reduction credits on an RFP basis to acquire the cheapest reductions they can on a quarterly or by 6-month basis every year. They're going to fund that program. They believe they will save between 80 and 90% of their estimated cost of achieving the 2025 goals by subsidizing BMPs. So there's a question there, Vicki.
Well, it hasn't come out yet, so if you could get to that, thanks.
I'm curious as to your reaction to that and other solutions that might be used to both lower costs meaningfully, not on a hypothetical basis or on a scattered basis, and try to get where we all need to be with the TMDL.
I like that concept, and I hope it works.
Stop.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania has. No, I'm good.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to see if you could share about the enforcement strategy that was involved in the Chesapeake Bay cleanup and the successes and challenges that may have come with that, since Ben brought up enforcement.
Otherwise known as compliance assistance, right?
Well, are you referring to the challenge to the TMDL that was brought by the Farm Bureau Federation and the construction industry in the federal district in Pennsylvania and then up to the Third Circuit, or are you talking about an enforcement case?
Yeah, there is a strong and important role for enforcement, and often that means bringing penalties or enforcement orders if a developer is not complying with their construction runoff permit, or a wastewater treatment plant, or an energy facility on the Potomac River is not meeting its discharge limits in the Clean Water Act. And Maryland, for sure, just over the last 4 years, has taken enforcement actions, such as against NRG for Potomac River discharges. We've stood up to uphold the wonderful work of Betsy Sutherland and EPA on the steam electric effluent limitation guidelines and trying to get that translated into the permits. And also taking enforcement actions when a construction runoff occurs. We need to do more. We also need to embrace compliance assistance, just like all the EPAs over in recent history have recognized a continuum of compliance assistance, but if there's a serious violation, you go straight to enforcement and send a strong signal. So that's an important role, and we have banded together with others and our bipartisan congressional delegations throughout the states to oppose riders in the Congress that would have blocked EPA in recent years from taking enforcement actions, implementing the memo that Sean Garvin put forward on enforcement steps. So it's an important role. It's just that you've got to communicate that it's not the be all and end all. It's working with the regulated community and finding a way to get to compliance, which also includes penalties from time to time.
I'll just add that, linking the enforcement and the verification to something that Ike said, the model assumes a certain level of, it's inputs, how many practices are on the ground, what if pollution efficiency do each of those widgets get, and what is the outcome that is going to be achieved because of it. If we don't have verification and if we don't have enforcement when there's problems, we're going to come to 2025 and the model's going to say that we're supposed to be a certain way along, and all of you are going to call the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and say, why can't I still go swimming after it rains? Why is the water not cleaner? So I think to make sure that we are meeting the expectations so that what is in the plans, what is in the model actually brings upon the results, we need an increased level of verification. And with that, I think we'll bring about some additional enforcement actions. I think it's just the reality. I don't think it's everybody, and I think there should be a chance to correct. I don't want people to spend money on penalties that they could spend on best management practices. But again, I think if we are not careful with those two oversight mechanisms, we are going to be surprised, even with a lag time, not to see more real-time results in water quality.
So somebody has the mic in the back, I think, right?
Yes, hi, hear me? Question for Secretary Grumbles. Countries around the world are developing nationally determined contributions describing how they plan to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And the scientists are telling us that many of those plans are going to fall short. And at the same time, we're hearing that if we're not on track by 2030, it's kind of game over for the climate and the Paris Agreement. I wonder if, from your work on the Chesapeake Bay, you see any lessons from that successful effort that might apply to the problem of meeting the Paris Agreement? And more specifically, do you see a need for some kind of international governance structure that can do for the world what EPA has done so successfully for the states and the Chesapeake Bay?
This is Jeff Peterson, who most of you know, who is a real expert in coasts and oceans and climate work. And I think it was Jeff and Mike Shapiro and others who, the first lesson I learned in 2004 was that climate change is water change, and that you really need to focus on the water component of climate change. Let me just say that right now, the really good news when you talk about climate in the United States, and this is from a state perspective, is that 23 governors have joined the U.S. Climate Alliance. Governor Hogan, certainly one of those, who are committed to the Paris Climate Accord. We're also having discussions with others for purposes of the next COP meeting. Bob Perciasepe knows all this, that maybe one of the themes will be oceans and water at the next COP meeting. It's going to be really important to help ensure that that's part of the discussions. But from the perspective of the Paris Climate Accord, I'm really proud that the state of Maryland and other states on a bipartisan basis around the country are saying that the states, many of the states are still united and know more than ever before we need to make real progress, and not just on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but on integrating water programs into mitigation of greenhouse gases, but also adaptation and resiliency. And so I'm optimistic on that front that even though we're at a low point in terms of the national or federal agencies' perspectives, that the states and businesses and cities around the U.S. are going to emphasize more and more the role of water and the need for commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions even more than before, and a greater sense of urgency to live up to the Paris Climate Accord.
I wanted to go back quickly to the comments that you made about the climate change and the modeling. I think obviously warmer temperatures in water will make it harder, the capacity for it to hold oxygen change. And, it's inversely proportional as we normally think of solutions in water. But the other impact of climate change is going to be changing the hydrology of the basin. And while it may marginally make it harder, that the pollution reductions that have been identified to meet the anoxia goals and the bay grasses and the visibility and everything else, there could be much greater loads particularly because non-point sources are a major lingering factor. So I just wanted to point that out. And I also wanted to amplify what Jeff just said, because I think it is instructive to a certain extent, although 190 countries is a little more complicated than a couple of states, but not that states are not complicated. One of my favorite things when I was the deputy administrator at EPA, people would come in with all these things that needed to be dealt with, and I said, well, what do you mean? They say, well, Bob, it's complicated. But there's two things I wanted to add to Jeff's points. The Paris Agreement is designed for the parties to re-up their commitments every 5 years. So there's a theory built in, which we will see demonstrated or not in 2020, not in the next COP, but the COP after that, whether or not the countries can increase their ambition. The concept was you would keep increasing your ambition. You wouldn't stick to the first round of nationally determined contributions. So that process, we don't know how it's going to work yet. I mean, there's a lot of consternation. There's a erosion of leadership in the world on it, partly maybe mostly because the United States isn't doing it. But I think that's important. And 2030, game over is I think, Jeff, that's too stark. Where are you? There you are. I think the idea of keeping it near 1.5 degree increase would be tough, if we don't get going. But on the other hand, keeping it, and I know this sounds defeatist, but keeping it at 2.5 degrees, which I'm not proposing at any stretch of the imagination, will still be better than letting it be 6 degrees. So I think, this arbitrary thing of 2030 that we've heard a lot about, I don't really think that's what's in the IPCC report. What's in that report is if we want to meet the 1.5 degree without having to suck a lot of carbon out of the air in the second half of the century, we need to get on with it and really have things going by 2030. But there are other options. There are always other options.
Can I just respond real quick to your climate change thing? So one of the values of utilizing these very quick, fast open source modeling systems is that we can isolate what the different impacts are potentially going to be, and therefore focus our efforts on what climate change impact is going to be the one that we most have to address. And what we find is that temperature is actually, the impacts of temperature is like 100 times more important than the potential increased loading from increased runoff, or sea level rise is actually going to benefit the TMDL. And so, and unfortunately, temperature is the one that we have least control over with any sort of regulatory mechanism. So Yeah.
I know you want to wrap things up, but I just want to say, on the climate front, Virginia, DC, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania are all part of this exciting new collaborative on transportation, the transportation sector, and how to reduce the carbon footprint. Vicki and the Georgetown Climate Center are facilitating that. That's a really big step for states on a regional basis to make a very important new commitment to reducing in the transportation sector. So that's that's a positive development. We'll see how it plays out, but that is one good thing to be aware of within the countries, I mean, the U.S. of states that are lining up to do more with a needed urgency. Yeah.
Another good reason to do it.
That's
Thank you,
right.
Bob. Right here, we'll probably take one more question
Okay,
or
I'm
comment.
going
Oh,
to
this
sneak
is
in
great.
it's a comment and a question for Ben's worried now. So I have a lot of experience on the Chesapeake Bay. I worked in Virginia and at EPA, but I also at EPA worked on a lot of geographic programs, especially the Mississippi River. And I agree with the panelists that, all the things you said about what worked for the Chesapeake Bay and the intergovernmental cooperation, bipartisan, et cetera, and yet, if I dare even mention the words Chesapeake Bay, when I went and talked in various places or with the hypoxia task force, they were like, close their ears. So what can we do to overcome that so that people aren't scared of a Chesapeake Bay-like program, but instead can embrace the successes of it? Small question.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is to not even talk about the TMDL and those limits, but if you talk about the watershed agreement, yes, the TMDL is part of that, but there are many more outcome-based community enhancements, the education, the habitat, all the results that will come about it that they're trying to achieve. I think those get to more areas where people agree. It gets harder when you get to the strategies, but if you want to at least open the dialogue and start the conversation, I mean, I very rarely, unless I'm specifically asked, talk about the TMDL. There's great collaboration going on to bring about clean water in communities. And, by the way, there was a lawsuit and a TMDL and, those acronyms. But I think that what it's trying to achieve and the work that's being done collaboratively to get there is what I would highlight. And then if they start to ask about the, specific legal mechanisms or things like that, I would talk about it. But I would never start with it. I'm sure you know that.
I just want, so Ellen Galinsky asked the question. Ellen, a leader in the Office of Water and at EPA, and then also in Virginia, and now a new star on the Chesapeake Bay STAC, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. And well, obviously, I didn't figure out how to help reduce the dead zone and serving on the Mississippi River Gulf Hypoxia Task Force, although we made some progress in building partnerships. And so to me, just like I said at the beginning, the Chesapeake Bay TMDL has political baggage in other jurisdictions because they see the numeric criteria and standards, and most importantly, they see an implementation plan that states have quote unquote, given up some sovereignty to have the federal EPA track and measure. So I think the key is continue to get commitments to invest in the real science, locally based progress that also includes some type of governance mechanism that doesn't have the federal umpire hovering over them and grading them every 2 years or sooner. At least have them, though, in the same room talking about partnerships that fall short of an interstate compact or a Chesapeake Bay TMDL would be real progress. And I know some progress on it, but
I agree with what both Allison and Ben said. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so with that, I see Amanda standing up. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. I didn't know if it was somebody from the next panel.
Hey, thanks for your work and your study.
This was a wonderful panel. We would very much like to keep the conversation going. So I'm going to call John Reeder and his fellow moderators up. If you need a break, of course, feel free to take it. And we're just going to move straight into the next session, which is next steps for building EPA, the EPA of the future, a conversation about what to do with the insights that we've arrived at over the last 2 days. Quickly, because I recognize it's late in the day and some folks may choose not to stay for the conversation, I want to put in one more thanks for our co-sponsors of the conference. So it was put on jointly by the School of Public Affairs and by the Washington College of Law, and that's been a wonderful collaboration. Thank you, John. But also sponsored by the Environmental Law Institute, the Hanley Foundation, and the EPA Alumni Association. And so we thank all of you so much for that and for being here. This is going to be more informal, so maybe if folks want to take the opportunity to move to the open spaces at the front of the room, this would be a good time to do that, and this is going to be more of a conversation style. And to this side. And to this side, right. Move to this side of the room and toward the front.
I don't know how many of you ever saw the old show Monty Python. You have to be pretty old to have seen it. But they did a change in, I don't know, their segue always was. Yeah, they can't do the walk. No John Cleese. But they always said, now for something completely different. So we're going to try for something completely different. And if we can deprive you of a table, I don't know, or pry you from a table, come on up, and you can even bring up chairs. We're going to try to make this conversational. We took the table away from our panelists, so this is like Dave Ulrich unplugged and Scott Fulton unplugged. We want to make this more of a conversation. So as soon as you settle for a bit, Derry's actually going to kick us off. Well, maybe Derry got scared and, oh, there he is. Okay. Looks like everybody's kind of, I want to start with one comment, which is, I thought we'd have like 20 people here at this point, and we'd have a little confab, and it's really heartening to see the numbers. This is fantastic. I think we probably have like 100 people here. So our format may have been designed a little loosey-goosey, but we're going to have fun with it. Do you want to mention? I said Derry would start, but I'm starting. Sorry, Derry. And Derry will frame this up better, but we really don't want this as a Q&A necessarily. We have, I would call, co-moderators here with us who do have some, we'll start with some statements to kind of get the ball rolling, but this is all about brainstorming and collecting ideas, and we have some note takers here who are taking it all down, and Michaela and Sebastian and Brendan. Where's Brendan Doyle? Brendan in the back. So we have people who are really going to be focusing on capturing the conversation, so we don't have to try to refine it all. And it's not like flip charts where we're going to do any multi-voting or anything like that. We're going to keep it freewheeling and capture all the ideas that we can, and then sort it out and feed it back to you somehow later. And we can even talk about how that works. Derry, do you want to start with why we are here?
I'm Derry Allen with the EPA Alumni Association, and it's been a pleasure working with John and American University on this whole project. John and I got together for lunch about almost a year and a half ago and began to map out a process in which many of you have been involved. We had some exploratory discussions with EPA alumni. We formed 5 focus groups that wrote a series of very interesting papers. 60 different alumni participated in those. Those are all up on the EPA Alumni Association website, and I think there's links from the AU conference website on that. We did an extensive survey that you've seen the results, and we planned this conference here. And we did all this with one idea. We thought it was important to have impact on the subject of what should environmental protection and EPA's role in that larger enterprise look like in the future, particularly thinking ahead past the immediate contentious issues of the present, past the present legislation, and say, what should it all look like? And the purpose of today's conference was not to keep people off the streets. We knew that all of you are very good people and would probably be up to very good things if you weren't here. So we're grateful that you did take the time to be here. But we thought that a conversation that begins here, no matter how good it is, if it stops here, then it hasn't really gone anywhere. And that's what we want to explore now, that if we can do two things. One, look at this from the point of view of the substance. Are there some points here that really need to be explored further by someone? And two, in terms of process, are there some kinds of convocations that different groups around the country might convene to talk about these issues further? That's the kind of idea that we wanted to draw out from the crowd at this point in the conference. So to get this conversation going, and we really don't want to be talking very much ourselves, we invited several people here. Dave Ulrich, who many of you know was our Deputy Regional Administrator in Chicago for many years and has been working very hard since then in the Great Lakes area. Scott Fulton, who held all kinds of different important positions, including acting Deputy Administrator at EPA and now President of ELI, and Stan Myberg, who also held a whole lot of important positions, including acting Deputy Administrator, have agreed to help us just kick this off and toss a few ideas out there, and also to exhibit good behavior by talking very briefly and hoping that everyone else here will, when you raise your hand, talk briefly also. And as John said, we've got some note takers. The last thing I should say is that it is an open question right now. What should the role of American University be? What should the role of the EPA Alumni Association be? We'll be talking about that, but we don't go into this with any particular plan in mind of what should those roles be. John, is there anything else we wanted to say just by way of introduction to yes. Kick off this part of the discussion?
Yes. I think if you step back even further, not you, us. See you, Terry. The thought was that, and we've talked about this before, this is a big year coming up, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, an election year. In our dreams, the environment would be an issue that somehow burbles up to become a matter before the electorate. And it's not a partisan thing. Like I said earlier, I'd love it if both parties embrace some kind of an agenda for the environment. Wouldn't that be great? So the idea is to help over the next year, what are things that can help build consensus around some ideas for the direction of the agency and environmental protection? So let's keep that in mind, that we want to keep this conversation going with the aim of influencing future leaders.
Okay, I promise not to take any more time than the two of you guys have taken already. And I'm a little less optimistic in terms of quite a few have headed for the exits already, which tends to happen when, okay, how are we going to make this happen? But that's what this is all about. And I want to give just a little sense of, based on what I have heard over the last couple of days, of what we need to do. It's about EPA and the broader enterprise, and it's about what it ultimately might look like and how we get from here to there. I think we need some structure. We think we need some process, and obviously we got to have substance at the end, and we need a deadline as to when we're going to finish this and what it might look like at that point. Much as I love Dennis Hayes' remarks yesterday, just do it. Michael Jordan did a lot of that, and Nike does a lot of that. There's a little more than just doing it. In terms of the big ideas I heard yesterday, obviously collaboration was used so many times. I think we need some kind of a national collaboration on this effort as to what the enterprise looks like that has regional and international dynamics to it. Public health, protecting public health. We heard that. We're not just tree huggers, we're going to be protecting public health. Make it clear what EPA does and what we have done in the past. We have not done a very good job of that. A big part of that is communicating much more effectively than we have in the past. Even us old white guys got to learn about social media and what that means, and we've got to do a better job with conventional media. We've got to do a much better job with effective use of data, information, and knowledge. The delivery mechanisms are out there. We've got to figure out how to use them. We must never stray from strong science. I didn't hear this yesterday, but I'm going to take the liberty of saying, yes, natural and traditional sciences. We need the social sciences as well. I think that's one of our weakest points. And I'll jump up and object to anyone who says hard sciences and soft sciences, they're all critically important. Hearing the former mayor of Washington this morning and the ideas brought up before of putting a better value and capturing the value of the natural resources and the cleaned up environment is really important. We need to reach out into rural areas and our natural enemies who don't want ephemeral wetlands regulated. We need to go out and talk to these people about it. We need to engage young people a lot more than we have before. We've got to have much more diversity at the agency. We've got to rebuild the spirit of the agency. And if we look around the room, too many people look like me or other genders, and we haven't made anywhere near the progress that we have. So, and I think finally we need to find some champions. Someone said Beyonce yesterday. I don't know if it's, Matt Damon or, whoever it is, but we need to get some champions. We need to get leadership. I don't know if the word apolitical even exists anymore, so let's at least be bipartisan about everything that we do in the future. We need a brief summary. We don't need a huge document about these proceedings. The ideas can be captured in something small that somebody might even read. Ultimately, I think we need some kind of a final document that doesn't go on for chapters and chapters and chapters, but a set of recommendations. We need to work with the chambers of commerce. We need to work with the Rotary clubs. We need to work with medical groups. We need to work with clergy. We need to work with environmental justice groups. We need to work with academia. We need to work with tribes and anybody else who wants to be part of this. So with that, Scott, take it away.
Wow. Lest you all think we're dense, we did recognize right before we came out here that we were disproportionately old white males, so sorry for that. A few observations. I think my role here is probably to talk about collateral and complementary processes, because the Environmental Law Institute is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And we're very much, building on the past to secure the future. We're having programming around the idea of reimagining environmental law. We had an event just a few weeks back at the Wingspread Retreat Center in Racine, Wisconsin. Pulled together a bunch of clear-thinking lawyers from around the country to talk about reimagining environmental law. Very interesting exchange. I guess my suggestion is that we probably need to work on the bridge work between those kinds of efforts, and we're not the only one. Yale's got a process underway as well that is also exploratory in this same sense. But we need to work on the bridge work so that we're optimizing the hands that are on the oars, if you will, and taking advantage of the natural attributes and assets that attend the various organizations. So ELI is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy group. We will always come up short when it comes time to advocate, but we are more than capable of producing products that take advantage of ELI's reputation for objectivity that then can be used by others for other purposes. We're also a publisher. We're always looking for content for publications, no better content than the kinds of things we're talking about here. So we ought to be thinking about how we work together in a more complementary fashion. Michaela, can you put that slide up? Oh, it's up there. Oh, okay. So anyway, just to give you a sense of some of the thinking that we're doing at ELI that we think ought to inform and influence the EPA of the future. This is our sense of the drivers that are pushing environmental performance and the governance systems that flow out of those drivers. And there are a few noteworthy points here. One is, you see in the upper right-hand quadrant, a law driver with public environmental governance. This is the work that we've been doing together all these years. What's noteworthy here is that it's one of 4 quadrants, and we think as time goes on, we're going to see continued evolution in this second quadrant, which is really private sector environmental governance. There's great potential there that we've yet to fully harness and deploy. We think these bottom quadrants are connected to the emergence of the machine era, that automation is going to become one of the primary delivery vehicles for environmental protection going forward. Big questions about whether an agency like EPA has the skill set to properly engage in that space. When we're talking about software design, and algorithms can either be a formula for success or they can produce defeat options for environmental technology, as we've learned in the emissions tampering cases. And then you've got this quadrant in quadrant 4, which is kind of the wild card, which is this intersection between big environmental data that we can expect to emerge from proliferation of sensing technologies and online sharing mechanisms for that data that can feed towards both of the top 2 quadrants. So we could spend all afternoon talking about this. That isn't my purpose, but rather just to observe that as we think about the EPA of the future, it really needs to be an agency that's thinking about each of these lanes, how to catalyze them, how to optimize them, how to shape and inform their evolution so that they're constructive and meaningful contributors to the environmental protection enterprise going forward. My last point is this. I think we do need to be clear about what the horizon is that we're talking about. And this may be a circumstance where having a dual strategy in place makes some sense. I think we're in a very different place if there's a change in administrations in 2020 than we would be if there's a change in administrations in 2024. I think the framing of the issues, the sense of opportunity and how to tap into that opportunity will be different depending on which of those 2 scenarios emerge. They're actually quite different. As materials are put together and as you think about how to be impactful, I think it'll be important to be looking through both of those lenses, not just one.
Well, Scott, thank you. And I must say, I want to emphasize what Derry said about no particular plan. And it's astonishing to look around the room and see the level of leadership and experience represented that's gathered here in this place, the mystic chords of memory, to quote Civil War historians, it's really quite astonishing, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But the first thing I want to say to folks here is simply that by simply being here, by choosing to be here, you've clearly participated in a really important conversation, which is, what is the future of environmental protection, and what is the future of EPA in environmental protection? We are, I think, at an inflection point on that, and I think it, with all due respect, it goes beyond just what the outcome of the next presidential election is. And those are the issues that we have been brought here together to engage. But look around the room, and I ask this for a point. We've talked a lot about relationships among institutions and levels of government and so forth. Relationships don't occur between institutions. There may be frameworks and all that kind of stuff. Relationships occur among people. They occur among people. And that's what you're building here in this conference. Sometimes connections, new connections, sometimes reconnections. But you're building connections between people. And that, I think, to make a third point, is what the success of this particular conference is all about. It is building on and contributing efforts that have already been done, which Jerry alluded to, especially the work of the committees who put together the issue papers, which are really, really thoughtful as a resource. And also kudos to American University, Dan Fiorino and John and the folks who worked at American who've helped to bring this together and provide a venue, a convening space. By the way, convening is one of EPA's most underestimated values, a convening space to allow this to occur so you can get those relationships. So do not fall into the trap of thinking that we occasionally do, that all of this is transactional and that, oh, well, if we don't have some specific outcome and we march away from here with the 5-point plan and all the different action items laid out, that somehow you've failed. That is a trap you should not fall into. By being here and participating in this conversation, you are adding value, and you never know where the outcomes are going to be of value. You never know. But by the relationships, you create the networks that make those things possible. And I will close just with one potential suggestion for what comes next. That there were so many things that were covered in this conference, it's almost over. In fact, it is overwhelming. I do think there is room along the lines that Scott suggested for some additional conversations, but maybe there'd be some value in having conversations somewhere else than Washington. So, for instance, a governance conversation might be held at a university I can think of in the Southeast, which would be a useful place to go, in which I might see if I can list some of my alumni in the Deputy Association to help be involved with, to continue this conversation around both governance in for the larger enterprise, if you will, and then what that might mean for governance at EPA. So with that, let me turn it over back to Jerry, and thank you very much.
In the spirit of what Stan was just talking about, I want to channel another Stan known to many of you, Stan Laskowski in Philadelphia, who wanted to be here but couldn't, and asked if I would just note to the group today that he is working with some of his current colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania at what they call their Institute for Global Environmental Leadership to, and that is basically a business group that takes on different issues and discusses them fairly thoroughly, researches them, and then publicizes what they found. They write some papers, they distribute them. He's in conversations with them right now to take on some perhaps major bites of what we've been talking about here, and to extend that conversation again outside of Washington in just the same spirit that this other Stan M, was proposing. So now I've done the Stan Laskowski thing.
All right, we know people are sitting on issues. I saw one hand go up here. I'm going to run this mic, and there's a mic here too. So, I probably could use Derry. Okay, I'm going to give this to Cheryl Wasserman.
Thank you, John. First of all, I want to echo what Stan said about this. I mean, the participation is extraordinary. and Dan and AU, it has been a real draw. I don't think you can call this a conversation, however. It was a series of panels and questions of the panels. And I think that there would be great value in having conversations around certain issues. So I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm going to be very short, and I won't give you my thoughts. Just in terms of next steps, I think that what we can take away from this to support a conversation are the questions that we want to address. For example, from the White House and EPA discussion or whatever, what is the scope of what EPA's valid area is? A lot of people have talked about public health and all of that, but in NEPA, which was really not covered, we have played a major role in wetlands and so forth, and this administration would really limit EPA's contribution where there isn't a bright line. We talked a lot about science and regulation. Those are bright line areas. But there's this whole area that are not bright lines. So what is EPA's role, and how do we advance that when we know we're one among many? Second, we talked about, we teed up international capacity building, but we didn't really talk about capacity building. We talked about listening, mutuality, what we can learn from the other countries. Those are broader than capacity building, which is, we're going to build their capacity. So what is that? The role with industry, we talked about inspiring industry and all of that and engaging with industry. How do you preserve your independence and do that, and how do you structure yourself? Or state, tribal, and EPA. I heard at the beginning, we have a regional role. Don't get in our face, EPA. You have a regional role, and yet we talked about a very good Chesapeake Bay program, but don't mention Chesapeake Bay and what we're doing there when we're talking with the rest of the country. So there are tensions that are natural and all that. So I'm just suggesting that we come up with the questions around which we want to have a dialogue and make sure there are lots of voices in that dialogue.
Hey, buddy.
Thanks. So I was really heartened to hear just about every panel talk about communications. And I think I'm one of the few people who actually, as a profession, did communications at EPA. And I never thought that in my retirement I would be asked as my first task to write a simple fact sheet for congressional staffers on what EPA does. And I was like, really? And, but I really do think we love our fact sheets and we love our websites, but we really need to leave the building. We didn't leave the building enough when we worked there. We need to get out into communities. We need to talk differently. We need to work with different groups. We need to communicate in other ways. And if anything has been demonstrated here, the ability of people in this room to speak eloquently and emotionally and in a committed way about this agency and about the importance of its mission. We have an entire army here of speakers, and we need to think about how to physically get out. And I'll just say that a few of us, Betsy and Dave Corson, who's here, the most satisfying thing I've done lately is we did very brief interviews on the budget on sports radio stations. We got teed up to talk about budget cuts in venues that I never in all my career ever had the slightest opportunity to get out to those audiences, and it was really satisfying. So more communications and a different eye on it.
We're going to try to keep it.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, Walter Rue, retired EPA. This has been a fantastic conference. The amount of information has been phenomenal. I just have one comment. It's just, maybe it's just the engineering me, but the magnitude of these issues are phenomenal, and somehow whatever we produce here, I mean, I think the public would be amazed at the size of some of these issues. Like we were talking about the Conowingo Dam. There's like 250,000 rail cars of sediment behind that dam, right? So, I mean, just some way to sort of just set the stage on this, I think would help the public understand what we're really dealing with here. That's all.
Okay, I think I have the mic. I'm Phyllis Flaherty with the EPA Alumni Association, and I just wanted to follow up when you talk about the reports. This conference is one part of it. Derry mentioned the work that the EPA Alumni Association's done over the past at least a year. We set up, just so you know, the EPA Alumni Association has 1,865 members with over 40,000 years of experience. Most of us were there at the beginning and all the next 30, 40 years of EPA's actions. And so what we did is we asked for volunteers for a focus group. There were 5 focus group reports. We then surveyed our members. You probably have this, and you'll see that listed as the first 2 things, but there are key takeaways from that survey. But to help with the thinking and to give you more information, the Alumni Association will be sending out an email shortly, sometime in the next day or 2, where we'll give you the links so you can see the actual the summary of the survey, as well as be able to read the 5 focus group reports, which were quite extensive. A lot of good thinking by people that developed EPA's programs and saw the successes and the problems and lessons learned. But anyway, watch for that, but thank you. You want to go here or?
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on what was said before about needing to figure out a way to catalyze all this energy. I noticed in the last 2 days we've slid a lot from really macro down to fairly micro, and they're all valid. But one of the things that I was struck by was Scott's graphic where you talked about brand management, I think. But I think that really coalesces for EPA as well. We have a challenge on how to manage EPA's brand. And I think that if there's a way to have different paths to say, how do we take on the big challenges? How does that affect EPA's organization and mission going forward? But on a micro level, working toward 2020 and beyond, what are the things that we can all do as individuals that we can share with other individuals to just make the environment a better place, which in turn will make EPA more popular? So if there's a way to figure out how to basket those things and even fan out, divide and conquer among us to work on those various things, I think it could be really rewarding.
Does anybody want to comment on that topic before we pass the mic off? Because I think that's an important conversation.
Yeah, I was going to comment on what Bonnie said about the fact sheet on, why did we have to have a fact sheet on what is EPA? What is our brand management? One of the things that several panels over the day, somebody talked about was trust, whether it was headquarters in the regions in the states in the tribes, our business partners, the public. We have a huge image problem. And when you said brand management, that's part of it. What are we? What do we do? Why is it important? And I think that's a huge part of building where EPA goes. It's not just how it reorganizes and how it recasts, is how we explain to the world, and especially the American public, why it's important that we do what we do. So I just want to follow on that.
Actually, I have the mic from a time before, if I may.
Where are you?
Oh, all right, carry on.
Go ahead.
Oh, he wants to stick to this topic.
wants to stick to the
Are you on
topic
this
for a
topic?
I am on this topic.
Okay,
Then go.
Okay, is this on? I have 3 thoughts which sort of follow on from what Barbara said. One is, yeah, it's important how we describe EPA, but I don't think anybody from EPA can tell this story to the public. I think it has to be told by people who have no public visible connection to EPA in order to be credible. So that's one thought. That has implications for how the message gets structured, but I think you need a whole bunch of different kind of faces out there. So that's number one. Number two, yeah, I didn't realize until I heard Ruth's panel how important the international stuff really was. And the reason it's important from my perspective is it's basically ceding the rule of law in all these, and it's not just ceding the rule of law in places like Russia, where there's, or China, but it's ceding the rule of law in places like America, where there's serious doubt about, does law exist anymore? Do norms exist anymore? Who do they apply to? And when and who enforces them, if anyone? So that's really important for both environmental protection and public health. Third one was, I keep, this cross-cutting thing about how do we harness private environmental management? How do we harness all this other stuff that's happening? It says basically one thing to me, and that is, how do you cross the statute so you're not in media-specific silos anymore? It says incentives to me. Incentives, incentives, incentives. If you give people credit, as EPA started to do in a really rudimentary way under the Clean Air Act SIPs for voluntary actions, but expand that approach so you're giving people all kinds of compliance credit, maybe not 100% credit, maybe not in all circumstances, to move in the way you want them to move. You can fold all those kinds of stuffs in without it being part of a formal program. I mean, this whole idea of water quality trading in the Chesapeake Bay and other areas is very much like that. It says basically you start with a framework, you give people an incentive to find a way to do things much more efficiently than the framework mandates, and let them try and do it, and then you verify. It hasn't worked really well for water quality trading. There's a whole bunch of structural reasons why that's so. It's worked a lot better in the air area, but it's the concept that seems to me is important. So that's three thoughts.
I was going to add very briefly to this. It's very atypical for me to point out the good news on something like this, but the one thing we've learned at EPN is, and it's a function of, unfortunately, this administration's wholesale attack on everything, that we're able to get pressed to things that we never ever thought would be covered. So in sort of thinking about the future, I mean, one thing we need to think about is how to package things for this broader range of reporters who are willing these days to actually dig deep into stuff they never imagined covering before.
Hi, I'm Steve Young, EPA retired. I'm just jumping in for a second here. Fabulous conference. We're still in Earth Week, and I want to do a 30-second commercial for City Nature Challenge. Friday through Monday, Google it if you're interested in getting out to the public and getting them involved. There's an app called iNaturalist. It's a friendly competition globally to collect observations of nature. But with that, I want to kind of riff off of what Scott mentioned. Big data was part of your quadrants. Big ideas. I think that this collective effort should pop out some big ideas for broad discussion. And I want to suggest several. There was a lot of talk about the implications of technology, real-time monitoring, the ability to disseminate data rapidly. I think that is so important, and it fundamentally changes the equation. When EPA was conceived, it was almost impossible to really know what was going on in the environment with any degree of spatial and temporal resolution. Well, now that's possible, including at a very fine, you actually could measure what's coming off a farm, for example. Now, maybe that's not a good idea politically, but it changes the equation when that capability exists. And that needs to be a really important part of our thinking about the future, especially if we're looking out 50 years. The second thing is, no one used the expression right to know. I didn't hear anyone say right to know during this conference, although TRI was mentioned quite a lot, positively. But the concept of environmental right to know, community right to know, worker right to know is such a powerful concept. And I think there should be discussion about a right to know 2.0. A next generation right to know that really comprehensively informs people about what's coming off of facilities, what's in their products. Again, the technology exists now. Things that weren't conceivable 40 years ago are highly conceivable now. So that bring back that idea of right to know, looking forward. And finally, Scott, again, you mentioned, but I think at least to pop out the idea of, maybe there should be some sort of an organic act for the environmental enterprise. And yeah, we all know all kinds of reasons why that's a scary thought, but if we're looking out 50 years ahead, it's never going to happen unless people start to, bring up the discussion, the pros and cons. If so many other agencies have organic acts and that vision, maybe it ought to be discussed. So thanks.
Thank you. Bill Hersey, I want to go to you, but may I let the administrator go because I'm not sure he can stay the whole time.
I would like to hear him, I'd like to have him hear what I have to say, if you don't mind.
Well, okay.
As a union guy, I'd like to assert a privilege
You're welcome,
of addressing the administration. Excuse me, Bill, if you don't mind.
But not a full speech, Bill.
It's not a whole speech, but I participated in developing the agenda on Work Group 5, which was EPA tools, processes, cultures, and resources. And I have participated on the basis of having been an elected representative of headquarters professional staff. And there's a lot of talk about the importance of employee morale and how that's really the major resource, and how the value of science and how we've got to defend science. Our labor union was organized in the early days of the Reagan administration. And it harkens back to a time when things were very much like they are now. And we organized basically so that EPA's professional staff could do their work with the highest sense of ethics. And one of the first things we did was to propose a contract, a section on professional ethics in 1985. It took us until 2000 to finally get what's known as now the Principles of Scientific Integrity adopted at EPA. And the heart of that set of principles is that the work would be done with objectivity and without predetermined outcomes, using the most important techniques, that employees would be cognizant of and understand the programmatic statutes that they work with, and that they would accept affirmative responsibility to report any breach of these principles. And there's several more principles. They sound really great, but all they are is window dressing now, because I was labor co-chair of the National Partnership Council when the PSI was finally adopted. We finally got Carol Browner to issue a memo in 2000. But the form that it came back from OGC when we sent it up in November 99 eliminated our process for adjudicating disputes. So if there is an employee, and there are many examples which you can find if you go to the website epaunionhistory.org, where employees came to the union complaining about violation of the principles of scientific integrity. And we tried and tried and tried various ways to resolve those things, and it never happened. What my contribution to this whole exercise was to put in a section called Staff Management Coordination and Empowerment, and it very much recalls good old Executive Order 12871, implemented or put out by the Bill Clinton administration, which empowered labor and management to cooperate in all manners of things. And what
and I wrote this piece called EPA 2045, A Staff Perspective, with essentially reestablishing the concept of staff and management working together and not being in contention. And when there's a problem with respect to scientific interpretation of data, that there's a process for working through that, and that the people who will be decision makers in that situation will be qualified by education, training, and experience to make the decision, and peer review could be requested by either party. That's the kind of thing that seemed important to me as a union guy in establishing reestablishing the kind of spirit among the staff that we're all in this together. We're all in this together, managers and staff. We want to make the agency successful. We want to look great in the public's eye. We want to do environmental protection, but there's got to be a way that we work in partnership and not be in contention. And that's what I think is important. I hope that this little bitty section, which I excerpted from my contribution to Work Group 5 called Staff Management, Coordination, Empowerment, eventually goes forward to some degree. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate the ability to make this statement. Thanks, Bill, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I have a few thoughts about branding, and they take me back to some advice I got from Russell Train before I went to EPA. He said, "You're not going to have any friends in this administration." He said, sitting around the cabinet table, people are going to wonder, what's he doing here? He didn't do anything to get us elected. And he said, and I know some of these people, Sununu not too well, but Darman, Quayle, they're going to consider that the commitment to be the environmental president had its purpose and it has now been served. And he said, you're going to have two advantages. One, you're Bush's kind of guy. I know him well. And Lee Atwater told me the same thing. He says, you're his kind of guy. I'm not. He's a policy guy. He's not so interested really in politics. Secondly, the press. And Train said, you'll get told not to do that much of it. And I remember Christy Whitman was told to stay off television. I told her to ignore it. I didn't get that kind of pressure. What I kept hearing was the president liked those appearances. This chief of staff didn't, and a lot of people around him didn't. But I had the advantage of a president who was supportive and who himself wanted to see us make progress and communicate about it. And it worked. Actually, the measure of whether it worked, according to Train, would be whether after a year the White House fears you. And that's where you want them. This is raw. This is just that as it was. And we knew what we were doing, and we knew who we were up against. You've got a lot of obstacles to branding right now. I mean, first of all, if you want to brand on issues, suppose you pick wetlands. You could get your cut off at the knees in the White House. No sympathy there, and that's risky. If you did it with reflection of a place or a series of places with local support and local involvement, local collaboration, you could do it. Global warming. I mean, the biggest issue of all. You don't want to get too far out in front of it if you're the EPA administrator. You can't. Again, the president would disavow you and the agency. And then there's the institutional attitude of the man himself, of the president, who said he was going to cut EPA up into little pieces. So those are the obstacles. On the other hand, I've been very impressed that the diplomats from the United States who are representing us at the COPs are playing a very constructive role, according to everything I've heard, including what I heard in Germany not long ago. And they're allowed to, and that's kind of generous on the part of some of the other countries, but they're taking a role in defining terms and in talking about the need for transparency and monitoring and legitimate measurements approaches. Well, isn't that interesting? Do you think the White House doesn't know? Maybe they don't. Maybe they've not been that interested. But there are a lot of things, it strikes me, that maybe can be done by professionals who simply stick to their lathe and do the job that they've always done. One thing that does strike me is that the international role is extremely important to maintain the fact that And it might sometime be appreciated by people around the president, if not the president. What Baker said to me about China after Tiananmen Square, and none of us at our level could go there, he said, I don't know what you're doing in China, but keep it up. And I don't have to know, he said, but keep it up. He said, they love you, and they love the agency. And I said, well, what we're doing is sending engineers to deal with cement kiln dust suppression and recapture of methane from mines and things like that. Don't raise the human rights issues. And they're engineers and we're engineers. Look for those kinds of opportunities. I think they have a lot of advantages in terms of international reputation, maintaining probably for the EPA team themselves involved. This was always a great source of invigoration to send people who are dealing with problems in the United States that were basically very small relative to some of the issues we dealt with in other countries, and often with having to steal from the water program or the air program to do it. But finally, I think one of the very best things that we have and that we do not exploit is our story. There's a whole generation now that probably doesn't know what was displayed in the photographs yesterday about how bad things were. And it's a fabulous story. And that's why there's no other agency I can think of that has that kind of significant modern story to tell. Maybe the military. I would really harp on it. I would constantly look for ways to illustrate where things were and where they are now. And I was so taken by the conversation about the Chesapeake. I think finally Ben said, after endless discussion of TMDLs, the Chesapeake has never been in better shape. Yeah, that's what needs to be talked about. That's fabulous. It wasn't easy. It won't be easier to go farther, but we're an agency that knows how, and we have done it. I think hitting down that regularly and in ways that people can follow and understand, and that don't complexify it all, that just really remind people in Los Angeles what it was and what the health consequences were, and just moving across the country whenever there's a chance or an opportunity in the regions and elsewhere. Make sure that is part of the EPA offering wherever there's communication.
Okay, well, that was very eloquent. So I want to segue into, first of all, thank you very much for a fantastic conference. But what I want to do is kind of think a little outside the envelope of something that I don't think we talked about. In my career at EPA, one of the negative things that gets thrown out at EPA is that we're the job-killing agency. And I was struck yesterday by some people being very enlivened by the question of how do we talk to the unconverted? What's with those people who don't understand the threat of climate change? And I think a big part of the puzzle is that we need to understand that what these people want is what we had. They want meaningful jobs that pay well with good benefits. And if they see their jobs in I'm talking about people in the fossil fuel industries, the coal miners, the oil field workers, etc. If they see that this is an effort that's going to eliminate their livelihoods, they're obviously going to oppose it. So I think that there's a way for us, because we are outside of the agency, to somehow think a little bit outside the box. I don't have the answers for how to, but to think about aligning ourselves with the natural desires of people to have meaningful work in the places where they live, so their children do not have to leave in order to have jobs in the future. And, I have to say, it kind of ties into perhaps a role for the unions. I continue to represent EPA scientists and engineers in San Francisco on the San Francisco Labor Council. And just 2 weeks ago, our union played a role in getting the San Francisco Labor Council to endorse the Green New Deal. Now, that's a big deal. That's a big deal because you don't get much of organized labor doing that. But we were able to explain it and to allow, and what's the missing part? If we just say we're green, we'll never get there. We have to talk about the New Deal part. And sure, aren't we all in favor of that for people who want just what we had? So I think it's a natural thing for us to align ourselves with. And again, the advantage of being outside the agency, because it's not in the agency's wheelhouse, but it's a way that the agency is often criticized. I'll just stop there.
I just wanted to echo what Bill said about EPA really being the best venue to tell the overarching story of environmental progress that we've made. Can you hear me? That EPA is the best venue for that story because all of that progress has been the result of the great work that EPA has done. When we're thinking about the next steps for building the future of EPA, we just have to be intentional about making sure that the voices of emerging leaders are heard, that they're not just brought to the table, but they're brought to the table and they are given a voice. Also, developing talent, attracting and retaining new voices to come to the table and tell these stories, because sometimes we aren't the right messenger. Even if we're saying all the right things, even though we have the story, we need to make sure that we diversify the storytellers. And diversity breeds innovation. The more diversity that we bring to the table, the more creative the outcomes and the better the results that we're going to have. And it's not just about diversifying the people, it's also, like Stanley said, diversifying the venue. So that's just what I would like to see when we're talking about developing the next steps for the future of EPA, that we are intentional about focus in that area.
Thank you. That kind of reminds me of the last panel yesterday, which I thought was the Telling the Story panel. It was fabulous. And I think there's a lot of work ahead for us in how do we reach different audiences. So thank you. Teo, when you get a mic, can you take it back to Vic Kim? And we're going to go to George now, and then I'm going to throw this mic up in the air, and you can all scramble for it. Oh, I'm sorry, Rob, after Rob, Vic, George. And then we got a loose mic. Okay. Okay. That's right, you did. We'll get to you after that list. All right, Vic's back there.
Right here.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Everybody has the order. Vic is back here. Vic is right here.
I think she was in the order. Yeah, go. No.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I don't think my mic's working. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so I just wanted to make a quick point. Just from my perspective, I'm not going to speak for an entire generation, but it's interesting for me to hear you all talk about the EPA's branding problem, because I would just suggest maybe a change in the frame of reference. I don't think the EPA has a branding problem for young people. I don't think the EPA probably has a branding problem in frontline communities that are already dealing with the impacts of pollution and climate change, a lot to what the point that you were talking about who to bring to the table. I just looked up really quickly a Pew poll a couple of years back, and around, support for stricter environmental regulations in the U.S. public as a whole hovers around like 50%. When you talk about people my age, it jumps up to 70%. So maybe it's less about how to change the narrative and just more about who you're talking to. Obviously, young people in frontline communities don't traditionally have seats at tables of power, but maybe then the question isn't convincing the people who have power now and bringing new people to the table. So just food for thought.
Okay. No speech, and I do understand what a brief comment is. For the last 2 days, I've listened to a persistent theme across almost all of the panels, which is the notion that the biggest challenge in front of us is going to be the loss of public support, and that we really have to deal with that. And it seems to me another frequent theme that we've heard about that ought to be carried into the future is we have to find better ways of making our decision processes more transparent. And we have to find a better way of insisting that on our initiatives there really is meaningful accountability. And I think those two things would help in the future.
Yes, I want to endorse what's been said on branding. My view of branding, having rebranded DC WASA, which was a disliked agency, to DC Water, is you can't rebrand and not do it on some basis. Now, my view on Scott, on your chart that had the 4 quadrants, the part of the world that's changing so rapidly were the 2 bottom quadrants. And I think a practical question that does render itself to what are we going to do in the short run is how does the agency change? How do we figure out who needs to be in the conversation, reach out because of those 2 bottom quadrants and how they inform the top 2, which is the laws and the way businesses function. And I think the opportunity of what the agency can do on that bottom, of delivering better results, lower costs, better outcomes, better transparency, is the story that can be a basis of a change around. And so the question, one of the practical consequences, I volunteer to help in whichever way possible, is some follow-up on how this bottom sector, technology and big data, how it can be deployed, connected to new audiences to the first 2.
Rob, I did call on Rob. Okay. Rob, go ahead, Rob, and then we'll go back. Sorry, ahead.
So I want to take on your challenge of how to keep the conversation going. You saw how quickly Stan jumped at the opportunity to have a conversation in the Southeast. Well, there are universities in every region of the country that are doing great work on environment. In the West, in the West Coast, in the Midwest, there are universities that could do this sort of thing. And I think that the planners of this conference did a tremendous job of coming up with a good set of panels that got at the key issues, the communications and sustainability and development and promoting technology innovation. That's a pretty good place to start, where if in other parts of the country there were discussions, and there are EPA alumni all around the country who could help with those discussions and help universities with the planning, you could then have some specific ideas come up in each of those areas, just like they did here. And maybe American U would be willing then to pull all of those together. But you could have a set of tremendous ideas in each of those areas. Plus, you'd have a bunch of people at universities and regions around the country who are activated and energized to address this. And I think it would be a great thing to do over the next 18 months.
I really like that, Rob. I mean, we can tee up out of this conference a lot of ideas and suggestions, and just hope that somebody comes along and, with the club and hits the ball. But we can tee it up. I forgot to mention earlier, if you would say your name for the note takers so that we can capture who said what a little better.
Oh. Okay, I'm Barb Karn, and I'm an old white female. And I confess I didn't do my homework because I came to the alumni group a little bit late, so I don't know your issue areas. But I read the title of this conference, and it says EPA and the Future of Environmental Protection. I would like to broaden that, and I would like to broaden it to sustainability. We do not have an agency in this country that is really responsible for sustainability. I mean, I realize it's a mushy concept, but we talk about climate change all the time, and that's, of course, the most visible part of sustainability. But we need to look at those other legs. We've got one down here, which is environment. But the other couple legs, bringing the economics and the societal aspects into sustainability could be done in EPA. We do small parts of that. But starting to move the agency into this bigger issue will help rebrand. It could still be EPA, but it would move towards sustainability. And I think that involves a value discussion too. I mean, what do we want to sustain? When industry talks about sustainability, they're really talking about their own industry. And we should not be fooled by that to think that they're out there for all of us. But EPA is out there for all of us. And I think it's the right place to do sustainability. And I think out of this conference, which has been excellent, we should be moving in that direction. And that may be our path forward.
So I'm Tom Tyler. I'm the Chief of Staff of the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. And I echo everything. I echo that. And I thank you for this conference. I have two quick requests for the dialogue. One is our foundational statutes are what we always go back to. We always go back to writing regs and enforcing them. As the pendulums swing from one type of administration to another, we wipe out anything that isn't writing regulations and then enforcing them. The gaps that we've heard about over the last 2 days, many of them have to do with these other things. Think about the favorite thing you ever had that EPA did, which I'm sure we then cut. And then a few years later, we asked you to tell us about it because you were the only expert, and then you finally quit and discussed. I mean, it happens all the time. So that's one, is I'd like us to think about, we need a statute. EPA is a regulatory agency. If it's not in the law and if we're not required to do it, we'll do it for a while and then it will get eliminated, period. So that's one question for the dialogue. What kind of a statute would help us do that to move toward real sustainability and all those elements, dealing with sectors, dealing with technology, being a convener? Second quick question. Quick example. As a chief of staff, I've been in there 5 weeks. I've been at EPA a long time. I got to meet with a group of people. I thought it was one of our divisions. And I thought, this is the most enthusiastic division I've ever met. Then I was informed, no, actually, these are the new hires. They're all the people who've been here for less than a year. And right, and so I had to think, oh God, we haven't crushed them yet. And when I talk about people being crushed, I'm not just talking about this current administration. So following on with the messaging, please think about, please research for us, because we're busy writing regulations and enforcing them. Please think about what you're hearing about how to attract and retain 20-somethings and 30-somethings. We know they're idealistic. We're idealistic. We also know they will not sit around and wait for results for 5 years. Or 10 years, or 15 years, or 30 years, or 50 years, like the people we celebrate at EPA. So please, I would just add that to the dialogue. Please help us think about how we can be more fleet of foot as an agency and how we can appeal to and retain those types of folks as well. And thanks again for this conference. Awesome.
Thank you. That's good. Can we give the mic to the gentleman between Phil Angel and Chuck? And I wanted to mention, then we'll go to you and then over here. I think we're scheduled to end at 4:30, but my daughter's been picked up from school. She's back there doing her homework, I'm sure. And so I'm going to stick around. I'm still on the clock. And so if anybody wants to keep going, but don't feel awkward if you need to leave. But if you want to stick around, we're going to keep our note takers going. And yeah, okay, all right. First, we're going back here. Oh, and then here. You. Yeah. You. Did you want to say your name?
I only was at the agency for 3 years in the pesticides office, but when I left the agency, I worked for a nonprofit, Beyond Pesticides, and then started a business, and I've been meaning to write this column, Rachel Carson, Job Creator, and I need to do it now, because she created this whole industry of less toxic pesticides, of baits, of pheromone traps, all this stuff that my customers demand, and that my customers are people who know that they want to protect themselves, protect their pets, their families. The second thing is, I've had the last 3 years the privilege of working with this man, Chuck Elkins, right there. Raise your hand, Chuck. Not on the EPA Alumni Association, but on something else about job creation, and that is a whole new industry that we just passed after a 3-year effort with this group called Quiet Clean DC, a ban on the 2-cycle leaf blowers, the gas-powered leaf blowers in DC. And that means that there's this whole industry of the battery-powered equipment and rakes and brushes too, that is going to be empowered and excited about moving into this area. So that's another thing that we did. He was he had this great expertise about noise and about air pollution and got that going with our group. So that's another industry that has been created. So I think looking at what industries are created instead of talking about job killing. And the third point is just a very small point. It's very important for all of us gray hairs to tell the stories and before we go about the things that we did and the things that we observed. It's a very simple way to do it. You do it by StoryCorps. Download StoryCorps on a phone, have your grandchild or child interview you. It goes to the Library of Congress. We could also send it to the Alumni Association. Very simple.
Sounds great. Yes, sir. Thanks for
For the
being
note
patient.
takers, I'm Dwayne Winters. I appreciate how this discussion moves from very broad, high level down to the lower level. In that spirit, I want to offer two concerns that I think should go into the record that I think are major challenges to the agency. Each of the administrators that spoke to us, including Bill Ruckelshaus, started out, or somewhere in their conversation, they talked about the strength of the staff and their value. And I want to address that. I was started in the agency. When the agency started, I saw the staff evolve. And we used in EPA an apprentice system in order to develop the people that are strong as they are, because there wasn't anything like an environmental protection specialist when we started. So you started out and you begin to work on a team, and you begin to learn a little bit about the regulatory process, and you begin to learn about the science of the subject area you were in, and you begin to then see this thing called the Administrative Procedures Act, and you built that working knowledge over 10, 15 years, and you would move up that hierarchy into a more management role. And in that process, we all had mentors. Some of mine are in this room. And so that's how we built that strong staff. And there were graybeards, the ones who had the institutional memory that we would learn to go to when we didn't know the answer. My belief is that that process is now broken. That we, just out of demographics, we had all the post-war baby boom people that came in the 70s and we've left. That we've had this turmoil of moving to a period of time in which the agency was ideologically driven and that bringing truth to knowledge wasn't what it was about. So I think we're going to have a new model of how we train and educate our staff. It's going to have to be a much more formal one, in which instead of having this occur for osmosis over a number of years, we're going to have to teach the civics of decision making. We're going to have to teach risk and the complications of what risk means, and begin to figure out, either using the people like are in this room, or in some way where we can streamline the process of giving the staff the tools they need to carry out their job. So that was the first issue I wanted to raise. The second one was, it's the decision-making context in which those people work. I always believed that we were really blessed by having Bill Ruckelshaus and Al Alm and a whole group of other people I could mention that understood the idea of the separation between the political level of decision and the kinds of strong technical analysis that was needed, and that you had the staff working on the technical analysis, and you didn't fold the politics of that in until you begin to get to the AA level. And we formally structured that. There's a gentleman right here that's helped manage that whole process of how we made decisions in the agency. And the best decisions were made when we had that process in its strongest and purest form. I believe that process is gone. Not only is that process gone, but I think much of the knowledge of what that process was is gone. And in looking at other agencies in which have had this collapse, it's damn hard to reestablish that. It takes leadership who understands that civic model and forces it through. But it won't help us to have a good staff unless at the same time we establish that formal decision-making process that allows for science to come into the decision, allows for politics to come into the right place. So I just wanted to get those two things on the agenda.
Thank you. We're going to go bing, bing, bob. Bing, bing, bob.
Sounds like a thing.
Can you remember the order?
Bing, bing, bob. Bing, bob.
He's the only one who's got a real name.
That's right.
Please state your name.
Alan Horowitz. And I'm probably one of the few individuals here who has spent a career outside of EPA, save for a couple of summer internships in law school. I wanted to respond in both a supportive but also a challenging manner to the point that was made about sustainability, and also connect the dots between that point and Scott Fulton's third quadrant. I agree wholeheartedly, and I think we really should take the notion to heart that sustainability in its broadest sense is an inherent part of the future of any environmental protection agency, any federal program that looks to that has as its mission the protection of the planet and human health. However, what I would challenge is in any notion that interest and that mandate isn't aligned with the private sector and the criticality of the role that the private sector today and in many forms, but even more so in the future, will play in that paradigm, in that model. I can't speak, no one can speak for all companies, but I can speak for two companies I spent 25 years at during my career that believe in the value of the agency, its purpose, but have at the same time an aligned interest for their own survival, and that all fall within a framework of sustainability, and it's sustainability for the planet and the delivery of the mandate, but also aligned with the long-term interests and protection and survival of the companies. And at the end of the day, I really truly believe any new paradigm, any new model has to much more directly and vigorously connect those dots in that third quadrant that Scott has outlined.
Thank you. Even if we don't get to you today, and a lot of hands have been up, you can write to reader@american.edu. It's very simple, reader@american.edu, and I will make sure.
Spell reader.
REEDER. There it is, reader@american.edu. It's the best email address I've ever had. Write to it, and I'll make sure that whatever you write to me will get into the notes for this session.
Thanks. I think I'm one of the few people here to represent an expertise in health as a toxicologist and epidemiologist. And I worked with the science advisor at the Coastal Administration, and then came back and was confirmed by the Senate under the Clinton administration for the National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. So I certainly understand what it takes to go in and out of the system. But I also want to make just a few comments. The Organic Act has been talked about for years. I worked at HHS as the special assistant to the secretary. We came up with what I thought was just a brilliant idea. We're going to put together all of the agencies within HHS that had anything to do with environmental health and called it a super environmental health agency. And when I presented the budget for it and everything, do you know what I was told? To use the language of a younger generation, NFW. Are you out of your mind? If you do that, you'll create a big bullseye, and when people come in who don't want environmental health research and don't want training in environmental health or monitoring or surveillance, they'll just wipe it out with one swipe of the pen. So just beware of that. I do think, I want to say, as someone who works in biostatistics, while this is a very nicely written document, I would also caution against interpreting a survey that 25% of people respond to. I mean, that's not what we would consider a decent response rate. And if there are going to be any other surveys, I would really encourage you to come up with some better way to get a broader participation. With respect to a lot of things we're talking about, you need enforcement. And that's sort of the missing piece of it. I was part of the group that the administrators sent to China to help them write their laws. And they, of course, they just took our environmental laws and copied them. That was great. So they have on the books our environmental laws. But until last year, they didn't have any standards for air pollution. So, and they had no way to enforce it. Now they have different ways of doing it. And finally, about big data, it's wonderful, it's exciting. But you know, the young people are going to be enthused about EPA. There's something inherent about being young, and they're learning about it. Reduce, reuse, recycle, that's being taught in the schools. They're not learning so much about climate science, but they are learning that basic thing all over the world, Republicans or Democrats. But if you look at big data for health, beware. Because when it comes to chronic diseases, they're very common, they have multiple causes, and the absence of evidence of harm, which can be pointed to often by the statisticians, should never be confused with proof of safety. And that's kind of what we've often dealt with. Can you prove that there's enough dead or sick people here that they are actually harmed by this hazardous waste site, this tower, this whatever? And so don't get sucked into that trap of asking for proof of harm. I think it should be enough to talk about the right to know about exposures, and that we still should be where we were in 1973, where Skelly Wright said, in supporting the right of the administrator to get lead out of gasoline, that brilliant decision said that the administrator can rule where there is risk rather than proof of harm. That the risk to children's brains was so great, and subsequently confirmed, by the way, by many scientists, that therefore EPA was justified in taking lead out of gasoline. And I think we have to get back to that route, and then the enthusiasm and the young people and the training and all that stuff will follow when we keep in mind that this is an agency that was founded to prevent harm, not prove it exists.
And we call that the precautionary principle. You know, a level adequate to protect public health with a level to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety, even if you get into picking the numbers. I want to just go at a very higher level here for just maybe 2 minutes, and you know, there's always been this saying, you know, don't waste a crisis. I think another Sununu may have said that at some point. I can't remember, but and you know, how do we? I mean, the reason we're all here is because there's a concern about the future of environmental protection. And I was really buoyed by the fact that we had a young person tell us, you know, that her generation is behind this. I think that's an important thing for us to remember. And if you do look at the Pew polls, I mean, there is differentiation by party, but if you do look at the polls, I mean, just this month in advance of Earth Day, Pew has done some polls, and we're in the upper 60% nationally of people who want stronger environmental regulations. So we shouldn't doubt that there's some public support, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up on this, but how to motivate that into action is, I think, the moment that we should focus on is the potential for I'm so tempted to say regime change, but I'm going to say the election in 2020, and that there's going to be between now and then a lot of talking during campaigns, and I think I'm asking everybody not to go out and work on campaigns because God knows who the hell they're going to finally be, but the key is, I think environment will be an issue in the campaign. I think climate change is going to be an issue in the campaign. And I think the opportunity here is to do something real right away in a new administration. Now, if there isn't one, then we got a bigger crisis, 4 years later. But let me just say, in the president's budget proposal for 2020, there was a $17 billion increase in the Department of Homeland Security's budget request. Some of it was for the wall, but not completely all of it. There was a $33 billion budget increase request for the Department of Defense. I'm just pointing out that we are selling ourselves short if we don't think about something substantial. I'm not saying like half of what I've heard has been, I mean, everything I've heard has been great ideas, but most of it is incrementalism. Most of it is, how do we do a better job of doing SIP reviews. And God knows we need to do a better job of that, and we do. And we should do that. And the more we can do that, the more resources that we don't need doing that when we get better with the states and the tribes and how we differentiate the work. And that'll free up a little bit of resources to do some of the other things we were talking about. It's like, how do we do more collaborative activities, all which take a lot of transaction costs? How do we really try to do innovation? How do we get how do we get data systems going? The Department of Homeland Security's budget request has $300 million in it for a new data system for some, not the main, it's not just some data system. So, we cannot sell ourselves short here. And I think that, if you look at getting better at the main things that we do with states and building that cooperative federalism and building more collaborative activity with the private sector, et cetera, and coming up with some new ideas, which have been bantered but need a lot more work, on how do we look at things at a sector level. We've toyed with this idea. We're seeing things are changing. We had a great presentation on this by Mike Vandenberg's team yesterday, or panel. All that stuff takes resources and time and data and science to drive it. So if you think about, I'm going to just throw this out there. EPA's budget was $5 billion in 1979. Today, that would be about $16 billion, just to do what we were doing in 1979. I think there's been a few laws passed since then, just a few. So a large increase in infrastructure and innovation demonstration work passed out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee just in the last several weeks, sponsored by John Barrasso, was a bill giving EPA money to do more research on carbon capture and storage. So, I'm just pointing out that even now, there's support for some of the stuff. So if you think about infrastructure and really getting serious about stormwater and how the federal government can contribute to some of these issues that we've heard so much about that are costing cities money, providing some more money in with the Department of Agriculture to do some non-point source work and large-scale ecosystem projects like the Chesapeake Bay or the Mississippi River. I'm talking about billions. I'm not talking about, let's have a $10 million demonstration watershed program. I'm talking about billions of dollars that really perks people up and gets the EPA administrators to go do ribbon cuttings instead of, announcing another enforcement thing, which I do agree we need to do. Science, really doubling down on integration science is what EPA does. We take a lot of the science that's out there, we integrate it into policy-ready information. Data and sensing. We keep talking about, even when I was in the EPA, we're talking about the next generation of enforcement. We're going to have all this remote sensing and everything else. Shit, the Environmental Defense Fund is putting a satellite up to look at methane. What the hell is that? Come on. Maybe it's a fake satellite, I don't know. The international role, which we heard a lot about, that, we have scarce and scant resources at EPA. We beg, borrow, and steal from everybody in the different programs to be able to carry out some of these programs. There's huge opportunity here. The world looks to us, and we could back it up with real resources. And the last thing I'll say is the idea of building sector-based approaches and finding new ways to hold accountability using perhaps the investment community and a public disclosure of plans and all these other things that you might be able to do that are super to the basic environmental programs, which we will become all much more efficient on, and all these other lean things that we're doing. It costs money. So I'm talking billions here. And I just think for us not to think about that would be a mistake. We've talked about all these new things. We should be thinking about pushing it to the wall.
Thank you, Bob.
And that's my position, and I'm sticking to it.
Somebody said to me, "Make America green again," which I really think is a pretty good line. It might fool a lot of people, yeah?
The rebranding is that we have more resources to be helpful, as opposed to just telling people not what to do.
We're not shutting down. But Bob laid out a lot of good things, actually picking up on some of the other sessions. But I wanted to kind of drill in a little more on like what are, and Stan talked about a university somewhere in North Carolina, I think. Could be, I'm not sure. And Rob talked about forums. Rob talked about forums around the country, and I think it'd be good for us to think of the how. Who can we approach? Who can we suggest ideas to? How can we carry it forward? Get more into how, because we got 2 days chock full of what. A lot of great ideas, but what is the how for keeping that conversation going? Sherry, you're in. Oh, Tom?
I started with asking the right questions. And this branding idea and what Bob was just talking about, what if we formulated this as what would happen if you gave EPA $10 billion, $20 billion, and we could talk about drinking water, treatment, all the infrastructure that we could improve, the city environments, what was happening with stormwater protection. We can talk about the public health stuff. We could talk about what Connecticut did when I first met Doug Costel in the early 70s, where they had teams of people going out to communities at the municipal level, somebody on financing, somebody on technology, somebody on science and so forth. And as a team, they were like a Chautauqua, going out and helping them. And so this business of EPA helping both industry and state and local governments and tribes do the right thing. And that involves not only saying what the right things are sometimes, but also working with them. When we talk about ourselves just as EPA, we never can accomplish what we set out to do with just EPA. We have an oversight role over state and local governments, but they are they are most of the glacier. We're the tip of it, and they're what, and industry too. They are our partners. If they don't do it, we can't do it for them. So what if we ask that kind of question and then start to answer all the good things we do?
It's an interesting thought experiment. I would like to see if anybody has not had a chance to talk for 2 full days. Who are those people? There's one. Only one person hasn't had a chance to talk for 2 full days. I'll come back. It seems like we're down to one mic runner here. Oh, Rob's back here. Sorry, Ma. Sorry, Rob.
Well, John just asked the question about drilling down into process, and I've had experience in convening dialogues, conversations with a range of different environmental and sustainability groups, and to pick up on the satellite that an environmental group is throwing up there, most of the leading environmental NGOs and sustainability groups at the international level use an online collaboration platform to have these discussions and to reach consensus on certain positions and to refine documents. And so I'm happy to follow up with you with all the information I have about that. While I have the mic, I'll be brief because I do understand we're in overtime. I'm Ira Feldman. I have been working for the past 20, 25 years on all the component pieces that will make up the next generation of environmental law and policy. Many of them were mentioned over the last 2 days, many of them were not. And using this collaboration approach on an online collaboration platform, we can cast a broader net than being able to get a couple hundred people here, or although I'd love to come to Wake Forest, maybe Stan can host us online. But overall, we're not thinking outside the box enough. I've heard an awful lot of good things. We all worked at EPA and we all loved what we did there. But there's a lot of criticism of EPA that we ourselves are in the best position to offer. We really weren't candid enough about that. Is there anyone in the room who really believes that EPA is not inefficient or bloated? Number one. Number two, to pick up on some comments that were made about sustainability, we don't have to look any further than the mainstream media to talking about the Green New Deal, Sustainable Development Goals, and ESG in the financial sector. That's environment, social, and governance for people who haven't been following that. All of that is the sustainability framework. It exists already. It's not a question of should EPA go there. EPA must go there. And in thinking outside the box, much more outside the box than the discussion has been here today, what has to be on the table is EPA's mission, EPA's structure, and EPA's relationship to other federal agencies.
I guess I've been shut down. Rob, you got the mic.
I'm Rob Walcott. I am presently with the Environmental Protection Network, but spent a great deal of my life with all of you, for which I owe so very much. And thank you for a magnificent conference and a great discussion. So many ideas have been expressed here in these last, 45 minutes that all function in many ways as complements to each other, not so much as substitutes. But one thing I want to encourage is the theme, John, that you and Derry have given of enterprise. And I know it builds on what Bob gave energy to 25 years ago. But enterprise involves producing an outcome, producing a set of outcomes to which many in society can aspire. And Bob also brought up yesterday, I believe, let's create messages and stories and images in which many, many people can see their future. And I think there is great, great power in doing that. We in EPN talk quite a bit about how do we localize and personalize our institution, our strategy, our messages. And I think if you build on something that's rooted in enterprise, that's affirmative, that's producing outcomes instead of constraining and strictly defending against certain outcomes, there is so much power and so much power for so many. And finally, I think we should consider therein business schools and how business schools can help us give form not just to the message, because business school is way beyond messaging, but it's forming structures and re-employing or adapting our existing structures and tools to meet outcomes that are moonshots to which everyone can aspire. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Rob has been a great supporter of this project and inspiration behind EPN, the Environmental Protection Network. And one of the people who really helped Derry and I scope out this whole conference. So thank you, Rob. You've always been a great supporter and an inspiration to a lot of people. So thank you.
You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Bonnie.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Piper. I had a couple of thoughts. First of all, thank you for a fabulous and really inspiring conference. It's just been really stimulating. Sort of on the business school, I don't know whether or not, sort of I had the idea, but I'm not sure the how, or the outcome would be whether or not people approach business schools or schools of public health to go in and talk about either what EPA does, or everyone knows the word environment already. It's in our vocabulary in lots of ways. But whether or not are public health schools really aware of EPA's quest to improve public health and protect it in some way, whether or not in business schools, whether or not people who are getting their MBA will understand at some point in their career, perhaps, that they're going to have an environmental impact statement, or whether or not you want to talk about that or other issues. But it's getting the conversation into different academic areas, too. Another thought I had was on the branding, storytelling, which has been mentioned several times. That's a wonderful way to do that. And I don't know whether or not any of EPA's partners that have worked to achieve lower emissions or could tell a story themselves. So that sometimes EPA's work is not necessarily told by EPA, but an outside corporation, a city, it could be told whether or not how they work with EPA, but it's less about the words EPA, but it's about people in those areas realizing the difference that's been made. And credit can come to EPA, but also to those people or institutions or the shareholders. There are lots of outlets for it.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. I think I'm going to do one more because I feel the sugar lows coming on, and then after one more, I'm going to give our panelists a chance for a few words, briefly. They've been very good, haven't they? Been very good. Yes. Oh, yeah.
We have a question. So is this on? Two other young people in the room. One thing that we were sort of discussing earlier that we think is really important is to think about not just the messages that you all want to be sending, but also how you want to send them and also what the audience is. We've talked a lot about, states as audiences, current staff, youth, universities, the Hill, but the way that you reach all those groups isn't going to be a one-size-all sort of thing. So whatever this sort of product that that we want to work towards, it just really needs to be able to adapt to how you reach out to a lot of different groups of people.
Thank you, and thank you for hanging in there. But we need that perspective.
I just wanted to say that I think a strength of the business schools that were just talked about by two of the people, Bonnie and anyway, the strength of the business schools are their alumni associations. So you guys are pretty darn strong, what you created here the last 2 days, and embrace being alumni. I mean, I get that you're embracing EPA, but also embrace being an alumni and what you can do and the power of that story.
Okay, I guess we're at the end. Time to go home. Safe travels.
I'll just mention that on the tech business, we have a conference that we're putting on at the first week of October in Seattle with Amazon and Intel and a bunch of other folks that are looking at the contribution of technology to environmental performance going forward. This will be part of the inputs for our process, but that'll be open for enrollment in the near term, so we'll send a note around about that.
I just want to thank everybody again. This has really been stimulating and thought-provoking, certainly. I'm sure not just for me, but for everybody here in the room. And take that energy and go with it. And remember that, in fact, there's a lot of good stuff happening that's not happening in Washington, D.C.
I'm very impressed that at this hour we still have about, 60, maybe 70 people in the room. Congratulations. You guys have really been great. And this exceeds by far the expectations that we had when we began to think of how this whole thing could be put together. As John said, he has an easy-to-remember email address, reader, R-E-E-D-E-R, @american.edu. I think we'll try to send out probably an email blast to the people who came to the conference, because we now AU now has all these email addresses, so you'll be able to follow what might come next. So with that, John, where'd you go? Yeah. Okay. Well.